From the smoky banquets of ancient Sumer to the rose-lit tea terraces of Heian, Japan, this is a calm yet fascinating journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how a shy cupbearer survived deadly palace gossip in and move deeper into why a eunuch poet could guide an emperor's every choice in Tangier, China. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Dawn of courtly companions. Sumer, Akkad, c. 2100 BCE. In the dusty twilight of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first cities rose like dreams from the alluvial plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, a new kind of palace life was taking shape. This is the story of the world's first male concubines, the Shugaga, whose lives unfolded in the shadow of ziggurats and within the labyrinthine compounds of Three Kings. Picture, if you will, the great city of around 2100 BCE. The air shimmers with heat waves rising from sun-baked brick walls, and the scent of burning incense drifts across courtyards where date palms cast precious shade. Within the royal palace, a complex hierarchy governs every aspect of daily life, and at its heart lies an intricate system of intimate companionship that would echo through millennia. The palace household of a Sumerian king was a world unto itself, a carefully orchestrated ballet of power, desire, and survival. At its apex sat the king's primary wives, draped in finest linen and adorned with gold jewelry that caught the flickering light of oil lamps. Below them, a constellation of secondary wives and concubines occupied chambers decorated with lapis lazuli inlays and ivory figurines. But it was among the male favorites, the Shugaga, that perhaps the most fascinating stories played out. These young men came to the palace through channels both tragic and pragmatic. Many were selected from pools of prisoners taken in the endless wars that swept across the Mesopotamian plains. Imagine a youth from a defeated city-state, perhaps from Mari or Eshnunna, torn from everything familiar, and marched hundreds of miles across desert and farmland to serve in the court of his conqueror. Others arrived as tribute, human gifts exchanged between rulers to cement alliances or acknowledge submission. The most fortunate might have been temple slaves whose beauty or talent had caught royal attention during religious festivals. The connection between temples and royal households ran deep in Sumerian society. Temple complexes weren't merely places of worship, but economic powerhouses that controlled vast agricultural estates and housed thousands of workers, artisans, and slaves. Young men who had shown aptitude for music, dance, or poetry while serving temple deities might find themselves transferred to royal service, their spiritual devotion redirected toward earthly masters. Daily life, for these palace companions, followed rhythms as precise as the movements of celestial bodies that Sumerian astronomers tracked so carefully. Dawn would find them rising in quarters near the king's private chambers, washing with scented oils in ceramic basins while servants laid out their clothing for the day. Bronze bracelets, symbols of their status, would catch the morning light as they prepared for their assigned duties. Music formed the backbone of their daily routine. In chambers where acoustic properties had been carefully calculated by palace architects, the Shugaga would practice on lyres strung with silver wire, their melodies drifting through corridors decorated with scenes of royal victories and divine encounters. They learned the epic tales that celebrated their master's ancestors, memorizing thousands of lines of poetry that would later be recited during evening gatherings. Storytelling was perhaps their most valued skill. As oil lamps flickered in the evening hours, casting dancing shadows on painted walls, these young men would weave narratives that transported their audience to distant lands or mythical realms. They recounted the adventures of Gilgamesh, the wisdom of Enki, or the fierce beauty of Inanna, their voices rising and falling with practiced emotion that could bring tears to royal eyes. The art of massage, learned from experienced attendants, occupied another portion of their training. Using oils scented with frankincense and myrrh, imported from distant lands, They would ease the tensions from bodies worn by the constant pressures of rulership. Their hands, adorned with those distinctive bronze bracelets, would work across shoulders that bore the weight of empire, offering physical comfort that was both intimate and ritualized. During the elaborate banquets that marked religious festivals and diplomatic occasions, the shugaga served as cupbearers, a role that placed them at the very center of power. They would pour beer from decorated vessels into cups of silver and gold, their movements choreographed to perfection. The brewing of beer was itself a sacred art in Mesopotamian culture, and those who served it partook in rituals that connected earthly pleasure with divine blessing. Their own sustenance reflected their privileged position within the palace hierarchy. While common servants might subsist on barley bread and onions, the shugaga received generous rations of beer and oil, marking their elevated status. They wore linen kilts of fine weave, dyed in colors that proclaimed their connection to royal authority. Yet beneath these privileges lay constant awareness of their precarious position. Palace life in ancient Mesopotamia was a web of intrigue as complex as any modern political drama. Favor could shift like desert sands, and today's beloved companion might find himself tomorrow's scapegoat. The shugaga had to navigate not only their relationship with the king, but also the jealousies and ambitions of wives, other concubines, court officials, and rival city-states seeking to place their own agents within the palace walls. Punishments for perceived overfamiliarity or breaches of protocol could be severe. Palace records, written in the wedge-shaped cuneiform script that was still young and evolving, hint at executions, banishments, and other grim fates that befell those who misread the ever-changing currents of royal favor. The line between intimate companion and disposable servant was drawn in invisible ink, subject to erasure without warning. Perhaps most sobering was the expectation that these young men might be called upon to accompany their royal master into death itself. The practice of burying servants with deceased rulers was not universal, but archaeological evidence from royal tombs at reveals the skeletal remains of attendants who followed their masters into the afterlife. For the shugaga, the very intimacy that gave their lives meaning also marked them for potential sacrifice. Yet their influence extended beyond the palace walls, and even beyond their own lifetimes. The legal codes that would later emerge from Mesopotamian civilization, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, contained provisions governing the treatment and status of royal favorites. These early attempts to codify relationships between rulers and their intimate companions would ripple forward through centuries, influencing legal traditions from Babylon to Rome. In the mythic poetry that celebrated Mesopotamian kings, echoes of the shugaga appear as devoted companions who share in both the glories and sorrows of divine rulers. These literary shadows suggest that the emotional bonds formed within palace walls were recognized and valued by a culture that otherwise placed strict boundaries around expressions of intimacy and affection. As the last light of day faded behind the western walls of and the first stars appeared in the desert sky, the shugaga would prepare for evening duties that might include anything from reading omens to providing comfort through the long watches of the night. Their lives, balanced precariously between privilege and peril, between intimacy and servitude, established patterns that would persist across cultures and continents for thousands of years to come. Golden Lotus of Power. Old Kingdom Egypt, c. 2000, 500 BCE. Along the life-giving waters of the Nile, where the desert sands met fertile black earth and the eternal rhythm of flood and harvest had shaped civilization for over 1,000 years, a different tradition of royal companionship was flowering in the shadow of the pyramids. The great pharaohs of Egypt's Old Kingdom, those god-kings who commanded armies of workers to build monuments that still pierce the sky today, surrounded themselves with a carefully chosen cadre of male intimates known as the Hemwa-Nesu, the royal servants. Picture the royal palace at Memphis, where the scent of lotus blossoms drifted across courtyards paved with polished limestone and the sound of sacred ibises calling echoed from the nearby marshlands. Within these walls, painted with scenes of the pharaoh's divine journey through the afterlife, lived young men whose existence revolved entirely around the pleasure and comfort of the god-king who ruled the two lands. These were not the broken captives of foreign wars, though Egypt certainly took its share of prisoners from Nubian campaigns and raids into the Levant. The Hemnesu were more often recruited from among the sons of provincial nobles, young men whose families saw palace service as a pathway to advancement and whose natural beauty or talents had caught the attention of royal scouts. Some came from the great temples of Ra at Heliopolis or Ptah at Memphis, their priestly training making them valuable additions to a court where the boundaries between sacred and secular authority blurred like mirages in the desert heat. Their training began in chambers hidden deep within the palace complex, near but separate from the women's house, where the royal wives and their attendants lived in perfumed seclusion. Here, in rooms decorated with paintings of papyrus marshes and lotus pools, the young men learned the arts that would define their lives. The preparation of royal fragrance was among their most essential skills, a craft passed down through generations of court perfumers who guarded their secrets as jealously as priests protected religious mysteries. Egyptian perfume making was an art form that elevated scent to the level of divine communication. The Hemnesu learned to blend oils of frankincense and myrrh with local aromatic plants, creating fragrances that were believed to please both earthly and celestial beings. They would spend hours in workshop chambers, grinding resins and flowers in stone mortars, their hands stained with precious substances that carried the essence of gods and kings. Music, too, formed a cornerstone of their education. Egyptian harps were marvels of craftsmanship, their sound boxes carved from ebony, imported from the lands far to the south, their strings made from the finest linen or even gold wire. The young men's fingers grew calloused from hours of practice, learning melodies that celebrated the pharaoh's victories or invoked the protection of the gods. Some specialized in the sistrum, that sacred rattle whose bronze discs created sounds believed to drive away evil spirits and attract divine blessing. The role of fan-bearer might seem simple to modern eyes, but in the blazing heat of Egyptian summers, it carried profound significance. The ceremonial fans used during religious processions were works of art in themselves, their handles carved from ivory and their plumes taken from the most magnificent ostriches of the southern deserts. To stand at the pharaoh's side during temple ceremonies, creating cooling breezes while priests chanted invocations to the gods, was to participate in rituals that maintained the cosmic order itself. Life within the hidden apartments near the women's house followed rhythms dictated by both royal preference and religious obligation. The Hemnesu shared tutors with the royal children, learning to read and write hieroglyphic scripts that connected earthly administration with divine command. They studied mathematics, astronomy, and the complex calendar systems that governed agricultural and religious cycles. In quiet gardens, where sycamore trees provided shade and lotus pools reflected the eternal blue of Egyptian skies, they received instruction in history, poetry, and the subtle arts of courtly conversation. Their position in the royal household was both privileged and precarious, marked by access to luxuries that most Egyptians could never imagine, but shadowed always by the knowledge that pharaonic favor could vanish like morning mist on the Nile. They wore fine linen garments that were washed daily and perfumed with oils worth more than a farmer's annual harvest. They ate delicacies prepared by royal cooks, roasted duck and gazelle, honey cakes and fermented drinks flavored with dates and spices. Yet their most remarkable privilege was the promise of eternal life itself. Unlike the mass of Egyptian people who faced uncertain prospects in the afterlife, the Hemnesu were granted the extraordinary honor of tomb preparations, that would ensure their survival beyond death. Falstor stelae, those carved stone portals between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, were commissioned for the most favored among them, their surfaces covered with hieroglyphic prayers and offerings. The most famous example of this privileged afterlife treatment can be found in the joint tomb of Khnumhotep and Nyankhnum, two royal servants whose burial chamber near the pyramid complex at Saqqara tells a story of intimate companionship that transcended death itself. Their tomb paintings show them in poses normally reserved for married couples, embracing with tenderness that speaks across 5 millennia. The hieroglyphic inscriptions describe them as beloved of their master and promise them eternal joy in the presence of the god-king they served. Such tomb preparations required years of planning and enormous expense. Master artisans carved relief sculptures showing the deceased enjoying eternal banquets, their images preserved for all time in painted limestone that captured the colors of life itself. Scribes composed prayers and magical texts designed to ease their journey through the underworld and ensure their welcome in the presence of Osiris, the god of the dead. But the path to such privileges was fraught with dangers that could destroy lives as easily as Nile floods could devastate unprepared villages. The Egyptian court was a place where ambition and jealousy flourished like lotus blossoms in stagnant water. Protective spells were not merely religious observances but practical necessities for young men whose beauty and proximity to power made them targets for envious rivals. Palace papyri preserved in the dry desert air reveal glimpses of the complex web of relationships that surrounded the pharaoh. Officials vied for influence, queens schemed to advance their children's prospects, and provincial governors sought to place their own protégés within the royal household. The Hemnezu had to navigate these treacherous currents while maintaining the facade of simple devotion to their divine master. Magic played a crucial role in their daily lives, not as superstition but as practical protection against very real threats. Amulets of gold and precious stones were worn against the skin, their forms copied from the protective symbols that decorated temple walls. Spells written on papyrus scraps were carried in hidden pouches, their hieroglyphic texts invoking the protection of gods like Horus, the Avenger, or Sekhmet, the Powerful. The routine of palace life provided some stability amid these uncertainties. Dawn prayers in chambers where the first light of Ra filtered through clerestory windows, afternoon lessons in courtyards cooled by Nile breezes, evening entertainments, where the pharaoh relaxed from the burdens of ruling a kingdom that stretched from the Mediterranean to the First Cataract. The Hemnesu participated in these rhythms as both servants and companions, their presence a constant reminder of the pharaoh's power to command not just obedience, but devotion itself. As night fell over the ancient capital, and the stars appeared in their eternal patterns above the pyramid peaks, the young men would prepare for whatever duties the darkness might bring. Their lives, suspended between the divine authority of their master and the human needs that connected them to the great river of Egyptian civilization, embodied contradictions that were as central to pharaonic culture as the Nile itself was to the land's survival. Between two Nile sunsets. New Kingdom, Egypt. c. 1000. 400 BCE. 1,000 years had passed since the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom first established traditions of royal male companionship, and Egypt had emerged from periods of chaos and foreign domination to achieve heights of power and prosperity that would never be equaled again. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty ruled an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, and their courts reflected this unprecedented wealth and cosmopolitan sophistication. It was in this golden age that the practice of royal male concubinage reached new levels of refinement and political significance. The palace of Amenhotep III at Malkata, on the west bank of the Nile opposite the great temple complex of Karnak, was a wonder that dazzled visitors from across the known world. Built on a scale that proclaimed Egypt's dominance, Its walls rose in terraces above artificial lakes, where lotus blossoms floated and exotic birds from distant lands added their calls to the symphony of palace life. Within these magnificent structures, young men from the far reaches of the empire served the god-king, whose authority seemed to encompass the very cosmos. These were not the Egyptian-born servants of earlier dynasties, though such companions certainly continued to serve in the royal household. The new kingdom's expanded empire brought a constant stream of tribute that included human treasures, princes and noble sons from Mitanni and Babylon, skilled craftsmen from the Hittite lands, beautiful youths from the gold-rich kingdoms of Nubia. Their arrival at court was itself a diplomatic statement, visible proof of pharaonic power that reduced foreign rulers to suppliers of human gifts. The process of transformation began immediately upon their arrival in the capital. Palace administrators, themselves often foreigners who had risen through royal service, oversaw programs of cultural assimilation designed to remake these young men into perfect Egyptian courtiers. Their foreign names were replaced with Egyptian ones that honored gods like Amun-Ra or Ptah. The clothes of their homelands, whether the wool tunics of northern kingdoms or the leather garments of desert peoples, were replaced with fine linen garments that proclaimed their new status. Language instruction formed a crucial part of this transformation. Skilled scribes, working in chambers decorated with scenes of the pharaoh receiving tribute from all corners of the world, taught the newcomers to speak, read, and write Egyptian hieroglyphs. But this was not merely practical education. It was a form of cultural conversion that reshaped how these young men understood reality itself. Egyptian was a language saturated with religious meaning, where words carried magical power and writing was itself a gift from the god Thoth. The artificial lakes that surrounded Amenhotep's palace were not merely decorative, but served as stages for elaborate entertainments that showcased the exotic nature of foreign tribute youths. Palace records describe boating parties where these young men, dressed in costumes that artfully blended their foreign origins with Egyptian style, would perform dances and songs from their homelands while the pharaoh and his court relaxed on barges decorated with gold and precious stones. Hunting expeditions in specially created game parks provided another venue for these cultural performances. The royal parks, stocked with exotic animals brought from across the empire, offered controlled adventures where the pharaoh could demonstrate his prowess, while his foreign companions showed their own skills with bow and spear. These events were carefully choreographed to emphasize both the diversity of the empire and the supreme authority of its ruler. The evening hours brought perhaps the most intimate aspects of palace life, as courtyards filled with the smoke of incense burners and the air grew heavy with perfumes that had been blended according to ancient recipes. The foreign youths, now thoroughly trained in Egyptian customs, would participate in entertainments that combined music, dance, and storytelling. They learned to play harps and lyres, to sing hymns to Egyptian gods, and to recite poetry that celebrated pharaonic achievements. Yet, beneath the surface of cultural assimilation lay the hard realities of international politics. Many of these young men were essentially hostages, their presence at court ensuring the good behavior of their families and kingdoms. Egyptian diplomatic correspondence, preserved on clay tablets found at Amarna, reveals the delicate negotiations that surrounded these human exchanges. Foreign rulers wrote to Pharaoh requesting the return of their sons, while Egyptian officials calculated the political advantages of granting or refusing such requests. The most successful of these foreign companions could rise to positions of genuine influence within the imperial administration. Some became trusted advisors, their knowledge of their homelands making them valuable intelligence assets. Others were granted estates in Egypt proper, becoming landed nobles whose loyalty was secured through material prosperity. A few even married into Egyptian royal or noble families, their foreign heritage becoming an exotic attraction rather than a barrier to advancement. But political marriages worked in both directions, and the foreign youths sometimes found themselves serving as intermediaries in complex diplomatic arrangements. When Pharaoh sought to cement an alliance with a foreign power, he might offer one of their kinsmen in return, creating bonds of mutual obligation that transcended simple treaties. These arrangements required the young men to maintain dual loyalties, serving their Egyptian master while remaining connected to their original homelands. The artistic record of this period provides tantalizing glimpses into the lives of these foreign companions, though much of this evidence has been deliberately obscured by later dynasties. Temple and tomb walls that once showed foreign courtiers in intimate proximity to the pharaoh were often recarved, their faces chiseled away and replaced with more conventional images of Egyptian officials. This systematic erasure suggests that later generations found something troubling or politically dangerous about these earlier depictions. The most dramatic example of such artistic censorship can be found in the monuments of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who briefly attempted to revolutionize Egyptian religion. His art broke with traditional conventions to show intimate domestic scenes, including depictions of male courtiers that were later systematically defaced. Whether this destruction was motivated by religious orthodoxy or dynastic politics, it represents a loss of historical evidence that leaves many questions about New Kingdom court life forever unanswered. Palace life for these foreign youths was a complex balance of privilege and constraint, cultural transformation, and preserved identity. They lived in quarters decorated with art that celebrated their exotic origins while learning to perform roles that required them to embody Egyptian ideals. They ate foods that combined familiar flavors from their homelands with the rich cuisine of the imperial court. They worshipped gods whose names they learned to pronounce correctly, while perhaps privately honoring the deities of their birth. The religious dimension of their service was particularly complex, as Egyptian theology demanded that the pharaoh's companions participate in rituals that reinforced his divine nature. They learned to perform in temple ceremonies, to carry sacred objects during religious processions, and to maintain the fiction that their foreign birth made them especially valuable offerings to the god-king's supernatural authority. As the sun set behind the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs lay buried in tombs decorated with scenes of their journey through the afterlife, these young men would prepare for evening duties that might include anything from intimate conversation to formal ceremonial roles. Their lives, poised between their origins and their adopted homeland, between servitude and privilege, reflected the broader tensions of an empire that had grown too large and complex for traditional Egyptian institutions to manage effectively. The legacy of their presence would outlast the New Kingdom itself, creating precedents and expectations that would influence Egyptian court culture for centuries to come. But in their own time, as they moved through palace corridors where the scent of lotus blossoms mingled with exotic perfumes from distant lands, they embodied the contradictions and possibilities of an empire at its zenith. Bronze Age silk chambers, Shang China, c. 1250 BCE. In the yellow earth heartland of ancient China, where the great bend of the Yellow River carved its way through landscapes that had witnessed the birth of civilization itself, the Shang dynasty ruled from magnificent palace complexes that rose like artificial mountains from the North China plain. Here, in the royal capital of Yin, present-day Anyang, archaeological evidence reveals the outlines of court life that included among its elaborate hierarchies a special class of male attendants whose lives were recorded not in stone or papyrus, but in the most distinctively Chinese of all ancient writing systems, characters carved into the shoulder blades of cattle and the shells of turtles. The oracle bones, as archaeologists call these remarkable artifacts, preserve fragmentary glimpses of Shang court life in writing that is recognizably ancestral to modern Chinese characters. Among the divination records, military dispatches, and religious observations, we find references to Sexo Shi, literally, small attendants. young men who had been castrated to ensure their loyalty and focus within the royal household. These bone fragments, buried for over 3 millennia before their rediscovery, tell us of a court culture that valued beauty, skill, and absolute devotion to royal authority. Picture the royal palace at Yin in the 13th century, before the Common Era, its massive, rammed earth walls rising 30 feet above the surrounding countryside and enclosing an area larger than many modern cities. Within these walls, arranged according to principles that would later be systematized in feng shui philosophy, stood wooden buildings whose peaked roofs curved upward toward heaven and whose pillars were painted in brilliant colors that proclaimed the occupant's supernatural authority. The very scale of these structures, requiring the labor of thousands of workers and the consumption of vast forests, demonstrated the Shang king's ability to command both natural resources and human lives. The Shu Shi lived in chambers near the heart of this complex, in quarters that were separate from but connected to the king's private apartments. Archaeological excavations have revealed the remains of these buildings, their wooden structures long since rotted away, but their foundation stones and drainage systems still marking the outlines of rooms where young men spent their lives in service to the Son of Heaven. Bronze mirrors, cosmetic implements, and fragments of silk textiles found in these areas hint at daily routines focused on personal adornment and ceremonial preparation. The ritual wine service formed one of their most important duties, connecting them to religious practices that were central to Shang political authority. Wine in ancient China was not merely an intoxicant, but a sacred substance that facilitated communication between the human and divine realms. The bronze vessels used in these ceremonies were masterpieces of metallurgical art, their surfaces decorated with teoti masks and other supernatural imagery that proclaimed the cosmic significance of royal rituals. The Como Shi learned to handle these precious bronze vessels with ceremonial precision, their movements choreographed to accompany chanted invocations and musical performances. They understood the proper temperatures for different types of wine, the correct order of service for various royal relatives and court officials, and the complex protocols that governed religious observances. Their knowledge extended to the agricultural cycles that produced the grain for winemaking, the astronomical observations that determined ceremonial timing, and the genealogical relationships that determined precedence among ritual participants. Bronze casting, one of Shang civilization's most sophisticated technologies, also fell within their sphere of responsibility. The production of ritual vessels required not only technical skill, but also aesthetic judgment and deep understanding of religious symbolism. The Qiushi worked alongside master craftsmen in workshops where copper and tin were melted in furnaces that burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. They learned to recognize the subtle color changes that indicated proper alloy composition and to assist in the complex process of creating clay molds for casting. The decoration of these bronze vessels demanded artistic abilities that took years to develop. The intricate patterns that covered Shang bronzes were not merely decorative but carried religious and political meanings that reinforced royal authority. Teoti masks, with their bulging eyes and fanged mouths, represented supernatural forces that the king could command. Dragons and phoenixes symbolized the cosmic powers that legitimized dynastic rule. The Siko Shi learned to understand these symbolic languages and to participate in their creation. Music formed another crucial aspect of their training, particularly the trance-inducing drumming that accompanied ancestral rites. Shang religious practice centered on communication with deceased rulers whose spirits were believed to influence everything from military success to agricultural abundance. The rhythmic patterns used in these ceremonies were precisely prescribed, their tempo and volume calculated to induce altered states of consciousness in both performers and participants. The bronze bells that marked different phases of these rituals served as visible symbols of the performer's rank within the palace hierarchy. The largest and most elaborately decorated bells were reserved for the highest-ranking Cioshi, while smaller instruments, marked gradations of status that determined everything from living quarters to food rations. The sound of these bells, ringing across the palace complex during evening ceremonies, created acoustic environments that merged human music with the natural sounds of wind and water. The architectural setting for these activities was itself a statement of royal power and cosmic authority. The rammed earth walls that surrounded the palace complex required the labor of thousands of workers, their construction representing one of the largest public works projects in human history to that date. The walls were not merely defensive, but served as symbolic barriers between the sacred space of royal authority and the profane world of ordinary human activity. Within these walls, the Sikoshi lived lives that were both privileged and precarious, marked by access to luxuries that most Shang subjects could never imagine, but shadowed always by the knowledge that their fate was entirely dependent on royal favor. They wore silk garments when most people dressed in hemp cloth. They ate meat regularly when most diets consisted primarily of grain and vegetables. They had access to bronze mirrors and cosmetic preparations that allowed them to maintain standards of personal appearance that proclaimed their special status. Yet the oracle bone records also hint at the darker aspects of their existence. Divination questions about the health and loyalty of palace attendants suggest that suspicion and paranoia were constant features of court life. References to punishments and executions remind us that the very intimacy that made the Sikoshi valuable also made them dangerous, potential sources of information that could be used by royal rivals or foreign enemies. Most sobering of all were the sacrificial obligations that could be imposed upon them. Shang royal funerals were massive affairs that required the deaths of hundreds of attendants, guards, and servants who were buried with their masters to provide service in the afterlife. The oracle bones preserve records of divination sessions where priests sought divine guidance about which attendants should be selected for these sacrificial duties, their death serving to demonstrate the deceased king's continued authority even beyond the grave. The bronze vessels and jade ornaments buried in these tombs provide our most direct evidence of the material culture that surrounded the Sikoshi during their lifetimes. Ceremonial weapons decorated with supernatural imagery, silk banners painted with scenes of the afterlife, and bronze mirrors polished to perfect reflectivity created environments that proclaimed the eternal nature of royal authority and the continuation of hierarchical relationships beyond death itself. As darkness fell over the great capital of Yin and the last bronze bells finished marking the conclusion of evening ceremonies, the Shi would retire to chambers where oil lamps cast flickering shadows on wooden walls, decorated with painted scenes of dragons ascending to heaven. Their lives, balanced between artistic achievement and mortal danger, between intimate service and cosmic duty, embodied the contradictions of a civilization that created unprecedented beauty while demanding unprecedented sacrifice from those who served its vision of divine authority. Lion-headed guardians, Neo-Assyria, 8th C. BCE. In the 8th century before the Common Era, when the Neo-Assyrian Empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea and ruled over peoples whose languages, customs, and gods were as diverse as the empire was vast, the royal court at Nineveh had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a cosmopolitan center of power where the conquered elites of dozens of nations served the King of Kings in roles that combined military command, ceremonial duty, and intimate companionship. The palace of Sargon II at Khorsabad, and later the even more magnificent complex built by his successors at Nineveh, represented the pinnacle of ancient Near Eastern architectural achievement. Massive walls of limestone blocks, each weighing several tons, enclosed courtyards that could hold thousands of people during state ceremonies. The famous winged bulls with human heads that guarded the palace gates were not merely decorative, but served as supernatural protectors of royal authority, their carved faces bearing expressions that combined wisdom, power, and eternal vigilance. Within these walls, recruited from the conquered aristocracies of Babylon, Egypt, Israel, and countless smaller kingdoms, served a cadre of young men whose lives embodied the Assyrian genius for transforming potential enemies into loyal servants. These were not the palace-born companions of earlier civilizations, nor were they captives selected merely for their beauty. They were the sons and brothers of defeated kings, the heirs of ancient noble houses, men whose bloodlines connected them to the very peoples the Assyrian war machine had subjugated. The enforced eunuch status that marked their service was both practical and symbolic, a physical alteration that made them safe confidants while simultaneously marking their separation from normal human society. This castration was not performed in childhood, as would later become common in other empires, but often in adolescence or early adulthood, a deliberate breaking that severed their connections to their former lives while preserving their memories of what they had lost. The process of recruitment often began on the battlefields where Assyrian armies achieved their victories through superior organization, innovative siege techniques, and psychological warfare that terrified enemies into submission. Young men of noble birth who survived the fall of their cities might find themselves selected for palace service, their potential value as hostages and administrators outweighing their utility as ordinary slaves or sacrifice victims. Transportation to the imperial capital was itself a form of education, as these captives traveled along roads that demonstrated Assyrian engineering prowess and through provinces that showcased the empire's diversity and wealth. They passed through trading centers where goods from India, Arabia, and the Far East changed hands, administrative capitals where Assyrian governors ruled over populations that preserved their local customs while acknowledging imperial authority, and religious centers where conquered gods were housed alongside Assyrian deities in displays of theological tolerance that reinforced political control. Upon arrival at Nineveh, their training began in chambers decorated with reliefs that told the story of Assyrian military triumphs and divine favor. These carved stone panels, which we can still examine in museums today, showed conquered peoples bringing tribute to Assyrian kings. Their exotic dress and distinctive features preserved in artistic detail that celebrated imperial diversity. The young men could see their own homelands represented in these carvings, their former rulers depicted in poses of submission that made clear the consequences of resistance. Language instruction formed a crucial part of their education, but this was not the simple process of learning Akkadian vocabulary and grammar. Assyrian court culture was itself multilingual, incorporating elements from all the great civilizations the empire had absorbed. A successful palace eunuch needed to understand not only Akkadian, but also Egyptian, Babylonian, Hebrew, Aramaic, and the other languages spoken by imperial administrators and foreign diplomats. Their duties within the harem complex were both mundane and politically significant. The royal women of the Assyrian court represented alliances with dozens of different kingdoms, their marriages serving to cement treaties and their children embodying the imperial claim to universal rule. The eunuch guardians who supervised these quarters needed to understand the complex protocols that governed interactions between women of different cultural backgrounds, religious obligations, and political significance. Queen Samuramat, known to later Greek writers as Semiramis, provides our clearest glimpse into the role these eunuch courtiers played in the highest levels of imperial politics. During her regency, following the death of her husband and preceding the majority of her son, she relied heavily on advisors whose eunuch status made them safe confidants, while their noble origins gave them the cultural knowledge needed to govern a multi-ethnic empire. The midnight storytelling sessions that formed part of their duties were not mere entertainment, but served important political and cultural functions. These young men, drawing on their memories of their homeland's epic traditions, would weave narratives that celebrated Assyrian achievements while preserving elements of the conquered cultures they represented. Their stories served as vehicles for imperial propaganda, while also providing psychological comfort to royal audiences who lived under constant pressure from administrative responsibilities and military threats. Military command represented the most surprising aspect of their careers, challenging modern assumptions about the limitations imposed by eunuch status. Assyrian armies required leaders who could communicate with diverse populations, understand local customs, and inspire loyalty among troops whose backgrounds reflected the empire's ethnic complexity. Eunuch officers, their personal ambitions redirected from family advancement to imperial service, often proved more reliable than commanders whose private interests might conflict with state policy. The courier networks that connected Nineveh to the empire's distant provinces relied heavily on these multilingual administrators, whose noble backgrounds gave them credibility with local elites, while their eunuch status demonstrated their complete commitment to imperial rather than personal interests. They carried not only official dispatches, but also served as intelligence gatherers, their conversations with local officials providing information about potential rebellions, administrative problems, and economic opportunities. The Chariot Corps, that elite military unit that served as both battlefield force and ceremonial guard, included eunuch officers whose responsibilities extended far beyond mere combat command. They supervised the breeding programs that produced the war horses essential to Assyrian military superiority, their knowledge of bloodlines and training techniques contributing to imperial power in ways that were both practical and symbolic. The sight of these castrated nobles commanding the very military units that had conquered their homelands served as a powerful reminder of Assyrian ability to transform enemies into instruments of further conquest. The architectural reliefs that decorated palace walls provide our most detailed visual evidence of their daily lives and ceremonial roles. These carved stone panels show eunuch courtiers wearing distinctive double rosette belts that mark their status as concubine officers, their dress combining elements of Assyrian court fashion with subtle references to their foreign origins. Their poses in these reliefs suggest men who had achieved comfort with their transformed identities, their bearing conveying authority and confidence rather than the submission one might expect from defeated captives. Palace life followed rhythms that reflected both the administrative demands of governing a vast empire and the ceremonial requirements of maintaining royal authority. Dawn brought briefings on overnight dispatches from provincial governors, military commanders, and intelligence agents scattered across territories that stretched from the Zagros Mountains to the Nile Delta. The eunuch courtiers served as interpreters and advisors during these sessions, their linguistic skills and cultural knowledge helping to decode messages that might contain subtle warnings or requests for guidance. The midday hours often involved ceremonial duties in the great audience halls, where foreign delegations came to present tribute, negotiate treaties, or seek imperial intervention in local disputes. These events were carefully choreographed displays of power, with every detail designed to impress visitors with Assyrian wealth and authority. The eunuch courtiers played crucial roles in these ceremonies, their presence demonstrating the empire's ability to transform conquered nobles into loyal servants, while their knowledge of diplomatic protocols ensured that nothing was overlooked that might compromise imperial dignity. Evening brought the more intimate aspects of court life, as the formal business of empire gave way to the personal relationships that sustained royal authority. In chambers lit by oil lamps and perfumed with incense imported from Arabia and India, the eunuch companions provided the emotional support that rulers needed to cope with the enormous pressures of governing an empire that faced constant military threats, administrative challenges, and the ever-present possibility of divine displeasure. Their quarters within the palace complex were designed to reflect their unique position in the imperial hierarchy, neither fully Assyrian nor entirely foreign, neither complete men nor ordinary slaves. Archaeological excavations have revealed rooms decorated with art that combined Assyrian royal iconography with motifs drawn from their countries of origin, creating visual environments that celebrated their transformation while acknowledging their origins. The religious dimensions of their service were particularly complex, as Assyrian theology required them to participate in rituals honoring gods they had perhaps once served as enemies. The great temples of Nineveh housed deities from across the empire, their worship serving both to legitimize imperial rule and to provide spiritual comfort to populations far from their ancestral homes. The eunuch courtiers served as intermediaries in these religious observances, their multilingual abilities and cultural knowledge helping to bridge the gaps between different theological traditions. Yet beneath the surface of imperial magnificence lay dangers that could destroy lives as suddenly as Assyrian armies could devastate enemy cities. Palace intrigue was a constant feature of court life, as officials competed for royal favor and provincial governors sought to advance their own interests through connections with central authority. The eunuch courtiers, their intimate access to royal decision-making, making them valuable allies or dangerous enemies, had to navigate these treacherous currents while maintaining the facade of complete loyalty to imperial interests. The carved reliefs that survive from this period hint at punishments that awaited those who failed to maintain this delicate balance. Scenes of executions, impalements, and mass deportations served as reminders that Assyrian justice was swift and merciless, making no distinctions between conquered nobles and ordinary subjects when imperial authority was challenged. The very intimacy that made the eunuch courtiers valuable also made them vulnerable, their knowledge of royal secrets and administrative procedures potentially dangerous if they ever chose to use it against their masters. As night settled over the great capital of Nineveh, and the last administrative dispatches were filed away until morning, these transformed nobles would retire to chambers where the oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with scenes of their own cultural heritage, alongside celebrations of Assyrian power. Their lives, poised between their origins as conquered enemies and their roles as imperial servants, embodied the paradoxes of an empire that created unity through diversity and loyalty through transformation. The legacy of their service would outlast the Assyrian Empire itself, establishing precedents for the use of castrated foreign nobles that would be adopted by Persian, Hellenistic, and later Islamic courts. But in their own time, as they moved through palace corridors where the scent of cedar wood mingled with exotic perfumes and the sound of multiple languages created a constant reminder of imperial reach, they represented both the possibilities and the costs of building political unity across cultural boundaries that had once seemed impossible to bridge. Paradise walled in CYPRESS. Achaemenid Persia, 5c. BCE. In the 5th century before the Common Era, when the Persian Empire stretched from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea and ruled over more diverse peoples than any previous civilization in human history, the royal court at Persepolis represented the pinnacle of ancient luxury and refinement. Here, in palaces built on artificial terraces carved from living rock and decorated with reliefs showing tribute bearers from every corner of the known world, lived the gull, umbar, the flower, amber ones, whose lives embodied the Persian genius for transforming conquered peoples into instruments of imperial glory. The great ceremonial capital of Persepolis, its ruins still rising majestically from the Iranian plateau, was designed as a stage for displaying Persian power to delegations from across the empire. The Appadana, or audience hall, could accommodate 10,000 people during the New Year celebrations that marked the renewal of imperial authority. The famous relief sculptures that line the ceremonial stairways show representatives of 23 different nations, bringing tribute to the King of Kings, their distinctive costumes and gifts preserved in stone that has weathered 25 centuries of wind and rain. Among these tribute bearers, carved with the same careful attention to detail that marked all Achaemenid art, appear young men whose beauty and exotic origins made them valuable gifts in their own right. Unlike the military captives who supplied labor for imperial construction projects, or the skilled craftsmen who were relocated to serve Persian economic needs, these youths represented the most precious offerings that subject peoples could provide, living embodiments of their submission and symbols of their integration into the Persian world order. The gull, umbar, lived within the royal paradise, that walled garden complex whose Persian name, Peridaesa, would eventually give us our English word, paradise. These were not merely ornamental gardens, but carefully designed landscapes that represented the Persian vision of cosmic order made manifest on earth. Cypress trees, their dark green foliage reaching toward the eternal blue of the Iranian sky, provided shade for walkways paved with precious stones. Water channels, fed by underground qanats that brought snowmelt from distant mountains, created the sound of flowing streams that Persian poets would celebrate for centuries to come. The architecture of these garden palaces reflected Persian theological concepts about the relationship between earthly and divine authority. Columns topped with carved capitals showing bulls, lions, and eagles supported roofs that seemed to float weightlessly above floors, inlaid with precious stones from across the empire. The overall effect was designed to create environments where the boundary between human and divine authority became impossible to distinguish, where the King of Kings appeared as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the god of light and truth. Daily life for the gull, Ambar, followed rhythms that reflected both the ceremonial demands of imperial court culture and the intimate needs of rulers whose authority encompassed territories larger than modern nations. Greek sources, particularly the accounts of Ctesias, who served as a court physician, and Plutarch, who compiled Persian historical traditions, provide tantalizing glimpses into routines that combined religious observance, artistic training, and political education. The Persian administrative tablets, written in cuneiform script on clay and preserved in palace archives, offer a different perspective on court life that emphasizes the bureaucratic complexity of managing such a diverse empire. These records show that the gull, Ambar, were not merely decorative companions, but served important administrative functions, their linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge making them valuable intermediaries in governing peoples whose customs and languages reflected the empire's unprecedented diversity. Morning routines began with ablutions in pools fed by springs that Persian theology considered sacred, their waters carrying the blessing of Anahita, the goddess of fertility and purification. The gull, Ambar, learned to perform these rituals with precision that reflected their understanding of Persian religious principles, their movements choreographed to demonstrate both personal piety and imperial orthodoxy. The scented oils used in these ceremonies came from across the empire: rose water from Damascus, jasmine essence from India, frankincense from Arabia, creating olfactory environments that proclaimed Persian wealth while serving practical needs in a climate where personal cleanliness was both health necessity and religious obligation. The perfumed baths that followed these morning ablutions were engineering marvels that demonstrated Persian mastery of hydraulic technology. Underground furnaces heated water that circulated through channels carved in stone floors, creating environments where temperatures could be precisely controlled, regardless of external weather conditions. The bathing chambers themselves were decorated with mosaics showing scenes from Persian mythology, their images serving as daily reminders of the cosmic forces that Persian kings claimed to command. Archery training formed a crucial part of their education, reflecting Persian cultural values that prized physical skill alongside intellectual accomplishment. The Persian bow was a composite weapon whose construction required materials from across the empire: horn from mountain sheep, sinew from cattle, wood from specific tree species that grew only in certain climatic zones. Learning to use these weapons effectively required years of practice, but mastery demonstrated qualities that Persian culture valued: patience, precision, and the ability to harmonize diverse elements into unified effectiveness. The archery displays performed before Xerxes and other rulers were not merely entertainment, but served as demonstrations of imperial unity and cultural synthesis. Young men from different corners of the empire would showcase shooting techniques that reflected their homeland's martial traditions, while competing according to Persian rules that emphasized both individual skill and collective harmony. These events were held in gardens where the targets were often exotic birds or mechanical devices that moved when struck, creating spectacles that amazed audiences while demonstrating technological sophistication. The gold leaf tiaras worn during Nowruz celebrations represented the pinnacle of Persian court luxury, their creation requiring the collaboration of craftsmen whose skills had been gathered from across the empire. The designs incorporated motifs from multiple cultural traditions: Egyptian lotus blossoms, Mesopotamian winged discs, Greek geometric patterns, Indian floral arrangements, all unified by distinctively Persian aesthetic principles that emphasized harmony between diversity and unity. Nowruz itself, the Persian New Year that celebrated the spring equinox and the renewal of cosmic order, provided the most important ceremonial context for the Gul, Ambar's court service. These celebrations lasted for days and involved elaborate rituals that reinforced the Persian claim to universal rule. The young men served as living symbols of imperial reach, their diverse origins and unified loyalty, demonstrating the Persian ability to transform conquest into willing submission. Yet beneath the surface magnificence of Persian court life lay political dangers that could destroy lives as suddenly as Persian armies could devastate enemy cities. The revolt of Megabyzus, one of the great Persian nobles who had helped Darius I establish his dynasty, illustrated how quickly favor could turn to suspicion in an empire where the concentration of power made paranoia a survival necessity. Palace purges that followed such rebellions could sweep away not only the main conspirators but also anyone whose loyalty might be questioned. The Gul, Ambar, their intimate access to royal decision-making, making them potential sources of intelligence for enemies, lived under constant surveillance that was disguised as ceremonial attention. Their quarters were magnificent prisons, their daily routines monitored by guards whose presence was explained as honor rather than suspicion. Their correspondence with family members in their homelands was intercepted and analyzed for signs of disloyalty or foreign influence. Persian court protocol required them to maintain perfect composure, regardless of internal stress or external threats. Their training, emphasizing emotional control, that reflected Zoroastrian theological principles about the struggle between order and chaos. They learned to express devotion through prescribed gestures and phrases, while concealing any doubts or fears that might suggest insufficient commitment to Persian authority. The religious dimensions of their service were particularly complex, as Persian theology demanded participation in rituals honoring Ahura Mazda, while tolerating continued worship of their ancestral deities. This theological flexibility was both a strength and a weakness of Persian imperial policy, creating loyalty through religious tolerance, while also providing opportunities for maintaining cultural identities that might eventually support rebellious activities. Evening entertainments in chambers where silk hangings created intimate spaces within the vast palace complexes provided opportunities for the personal relationships that sustained royal authority through emotional bonds that transcended political calculation. The Gul, Ambar served as companions whose exotic origins and cultural knowledge provided intellectual stimulation, while their eunuch status made them safe confidants for rulers who could trust no one, whose personal ambitions might conflict with imperial interests. As night fell over Persepolis, and the eternal flame that burned atop the great fire altars cast flickering shadows across courtyards, where the scent of cypress trees mingled with exotic perfumes, these young men would prepare for duties that might include anything from intimate conversation to participation in religious ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order upon which Persian authority claimed to depend. Their lives, suspended between their origins as conquered subjects and their roles as imperial servants, embodied the contradictions of an empire that created unity through diversity, while maintaining control through the constant threat of violence against those who challenged Persian supremacy. Silvery lyre evenings, classical Greece, 4th c. BCE. In the wine-dark twilight of classical Athens, when the city-state had achieved unprecedented heights of cultural achievement and democratic experimentation. The relationship between older men and beautiful youths had evolved into something far more complex than mere physical attraction or simple economic transaction. The symposium culture that flourished in private homes throughout Attica created environments where the boundaries between education, entertainment, and intimate companionship became pleasantly blurred, and where young men known as Paetica and Eromenoi found themselves occupying roles that were simultaneously privileged and precarious. Picture an evening gathering in the andron of a wealthy Athenian's house, its walls decorated with red figure pottery, showing scenes from Homer, and its floors covered with couches, arranged to encourage conversation and contemplation. The air carries the scent of wine mixed with water in craters that are themselves works of art, their surfaces painted with images of gods and heroes whose stories provide both entertainment and moral instruction. Oil lamps cast dancing shadows that transform painted figures into living presences, while the sound of the orlos and lyre creates musical backgrounds for discussions that range from philosophy to politics to the intimate concerns of daily life. The young men who participated in these gatherings occupied a social position that defied simple categorization. They were neither slaves, whose bodies could be used without consideration, nor free citizens, whose participation would be governed by strict protocols of social equality. Instead, they inhabited a liminal space where beauty, education, and social connections combined to create opportunities for advancement that were unavailable through conventional means. Many came from families of moderate means whose social ambitions exceeded their financial resources, youths whose natural beauty and intellectual promise offered pathways to prosperity that their birth circumstances might otherwise have denied them. Others were foreigners, perhaps from Greek colonies or allied cities, whose exotic origins added to their appeal, while their outsider status made them safe companions for men whose political activities required absolute discretion. The daily routine of such a young man might begin in the household of Timotheus of Miletus, the famous musician whose innovations in lyre technique had revolutionized Greek musical culture. Here, in chambers where the morning light filtered through windows designed to provide optimal illumination for reading, the youth would receive instruction in musical arts that were considered essential for any educated person. The lyre itself was an instrument that demanded not only technical skill, but also deep understanding of the mathematical relationships that Greek theorists believed governed both musical harmony and cosmic order. The lessons extended far beyond mere performance technique to encompass the broader cultural knowledge that made music meaningful in Greek society. Students learned the traditional song cycles that celebrated heroic achievements, the hymns that honored various gods and goddesses, and the newer compositions that reflected contemporary artistic innovations. They studied the relationships between different musical modes and their supposed effects on human emotion and character, knowledge that reflected Greek beliefs about the power of art to shape both individual psychology and social behavior. The philosophical dimension of their education often took place in the gardens and walkways surrounding Plato's academy, where the boundaries between teacher and student, mentor and companion, intellectual inquiry, and personal relationship created environments that encouraged both rigorous thinking and intimate friendship. Here, beneath the olive trees that Athena had given to her city, young men participated in dialogues that explored fundamental questions about justice, beauty, truth, and the proper ordering of human society. The Platonic dialogues themselves, with their careful attention to the dynamics of conversation and their subtle exploration of the relationships between the participants, provide our best evidence for understanding how these educational relationships actually functioned. The young men who appear in these texts are not passive recipients of wisdom, but active participants in intellectual exploration, their questions and objections driving the conversations forward, while their beauty and charm create atmospheres that make rigorous thinking pleasurable rather than burdensome. Yet the social position of these young men was fraught with contradictions that could create both opportunities and dangers. Athenian law and custom drew sharp distinctions between relationships that were considered educationally beneficial and those that were merely exploitative. But these distinctions were often difficult to maintain in practice. The trial of Timaeus, prosecuted by the orator Achaemenid for allegedly prostituting himself in his youth, illustrates how quickly accusations of impropriety could destroy reputations and political careers. The speech that Achaemenid delivered during this trial, preserved among the masterpieces of Athenian oratory, reveals the complex social attitudes that surrounded these relationships. While acknowledging that romantic friendships between older and younger men were both common and socially acceptable, the orator insisted that there were crucial differences between noble love that inspired virtue and degraded relationships that corrupted character. The challenge for young men navigating this social landscape was learning to maintain these distinctions while pursuing relationships that might provide both emotional fulfillment and practical advancement. Daily life in an Athenian tycoon's household provided numerous opportunities for both education and intimate companionship, as the domestic routines of wealthy families created natural contexts for the development of personal relationships. Morning exercises in the gymnasium, where young men displayed their physical beauty while competing in athletic contests that were believed to develop both bodily perfection and moral character. Afternoon discussions in the library, where scrolls containing the works of Homer, Hesiod, and the great tragedians provided texts for both literary analysis and moral reflection. Evening symposia, where the careful mixing of wine and water created conditions that encouraged both intellectual conversation and emotional intimacy, as participants reclined on couches arranged to facilitate both group discussion and private conversation. The protocols that governed these gatherings were complex, involving elaborate rules about drinking, speaking, and the appropriate expression of various emotions. But the overall effect was to create environments where relationships could develop naturally while remaining within socially acceptable boundaries. The physical setting of these relationships was itself significant, as Athenian houses were designed to provide both public spaces for formal, entertaining, and private areas, where intimate friendships could flourish away from public scrutiny. The andron, or men's quarters, was typically separated from the gynekeion, where women spent most of their time, creating male-only environments where relationships between men and youths could develop without the complications that might arise from the presence of wives and daughters. The decoration of these spaces often reflected the cultural values that surrounded these relationships, with pottery, sculpture, and wall paintings that celebrated both heroic friendship and romantic love between males. The famous Achilles and Patroclus, whose relationship was interpreted by classical Greeks as the ideal of heroic friendship, appeared frequently in artistic representations that adorned domestic spaces where similar relationships were being cultivated among living men. The economic dimensions of these relationships were both important and carefully disguised, as direct payment for companionship would have degraded the relationship into mere prostitution, while ignoring economic realities would have made the relationships impossible for young men who lacked independent financial resources. Gift-giving provided a socially acceptable mechanism for transferring wealth, while maintaining the fiction that the relationship was based on mutual affection rather than economic necessity. These gifts might include anything from expensive clothing and jewelry to books and musical instruments, from athletic equipment to exotic foods and wines imported from distant parts of the Greek world. The value and appropriateness of such gifts were carefully calculated to demonstrate generosity while avoiding the appearance of payment, a delicate balance that required deep understanding of social conventions and personal psychology. The political dimensions of these relationships were equally complex, as intimate friendships could provide access to networks of influence and information that were crucial for success in Athenian democratic politics. Young men who cultivated relationships with established citizens might gain opportunities to participate in political activities that would otherwise be closed to them, while older men might use these relationships to extend their influence among younger generations who would eventually inherit political leadership. Yet these same political connections could become dangerous if they were perceived as threatening to democratic equality, or if they became associated with anti-democratic conspiracies. The constant tension between oligarchic and democratic factions in Athenian politics meant that any relationship that seemed to promote elite solidarity at the expense of popular sovereignty could become politically suspect. The philosophical schools that flourished in classical Athens provided alternative contexts for these relationships, environments where intellectual inquiry could legitimize intimate friendships while creating communities that transcended conventional social boundaries. The academy, the lyceum, and the other philosophical institutions created spaces where relationships based on shared intellectual interests could develop into lifelong partnerships that enriched both participants while contributing to the broader cultural achievements of classical civilization. As the evening shadows lengthened across the Athenian agora and the first stars appeared above the Acropolis, where Athena's temple proclaimed the city's dedication to wisdom and civilization, these young men would prepare for social obligations that required them to navigate carefully between personal desire and public expectation, between individual advancement and social conformity. Their lives, poised between youth and maturity, between dependence and independence, between private affection and public scrutiny, embodied the tensions and possibilities of a civilization that valued both individual excellence and collective harmony, while struggling to reconcile these potentially conflicting ideals. Papyrus, peacock feathers, Ptolemaic Egypt, Thread, c. BCE. In the 3rd century before the Common Era, when Alexander's conquests had shattered the ancient world and created new hybrid civilizations that blended Greek ambition with Oriental luxury, nowhere was this cultural fusion more dramatically realized than in Alexandria, the gleaming capital of Ptolemaic Egypt. Here, where the Mediterranean met the Nile and the lighthouse of Pharos guided ships carrying goods and ideas from 3 continents, the court of the Ptolemies created environments of unprecedented sophistication, where male favorites lived lives that combined Greek intellectual pursuits with Egyptian ceremonial splendor. The palace complex at Alexandria was itself a wonder that dazzled visitors from across the Hellenistic world, its buildings arranged around courtyards where exotic plants from India and Ethiopia grew beside olive trees and grapevines from the Greek islands. The famous library and museum, those institutions that made Alexandria the intellectual capital of the ancient world, were integrated into the royal residence, creating environments where scholarship and courtly entertainment flowed seamlessly together in ways that would have been impossible in the more rigid hierarchies of earlier civilizations. The male favorites who lived within this complex, recruited from across the Greek world and the conquered territories of Alexander's empire, embodied the cosmopolitan spirit that made Ptolemaic culture so distinctive. Unlike the enslaved concubines of earlier Near Eastern courts or the citizen companions of classical Athens, these young men occupied positions that reflected the hybrid nature of Hellenistic civilization itself, combining Greek concepts of educated friendship with Egyptian traditions of royal intimacy and Persian models of court luxury. Many came from the Greek cities of Asia Minor, whose ancient cultures had been enriched by centuries of contact with Persian and other Oriental civilizations, making them ideal intermediaries in a court that sought to rule over populations whose diversity exceeded even that of the Persian Empire. Others were recruited from the newly founded Greek colonies that dotted the shores of the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, young men whose families had sought fortune in Alexander's new world, but whose own prospects might be advanced through court service. The daily routines of these favorites reflected the unique character of Alexandrian court culture, where Greek intellectual traditions were enriched by Egyptian ceremonial practices and Persian luxury. Morning lessons in the museum, where scholars from across the Greek world gathered to study mathematics, astronomy, geography, and natural philosophy. The famous Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth while serving as head librarian, often taught these court companions alongside the professional scholars who made Alexandria the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. The scroll-copying races that formed part of their education were both practical training and intellectual competition, as these young men learned to reproduce the texts that filled the library's legendary collection. Working with papyrus that grew in the marshes of the Nile Delta and ink made from carbon and gum arabic, they developed the calligraphic skills that were essential for literary culture while competing to see who could produce the most accurate and beautiful copies of works by Homer, Sophocles, Aristotle, and other masters of Greek literature. These copying exercises served multiple purposes beyond mere education, as the library's ambitious project of collecting all human knowledge required enormous amounts of skilled labor. The court favorites, whose education and social status made them reliable workers, contributed to scholarly projects that advanced human understanding while developing skills that made them valuable administrative assistants in governing an empire that stretched from Cyrenaica to the First Cataract. The luxury that surrounded their daily lives reflected the enormous wealth that flowed into Alexandria from trade networks that connected the Indian Ocean with the Mediterranean Sea. Their sandals were made from crocodile skin leather that had been dyed in brilliant colors and decorated with gold thread. Exotic footwear that proclaimed their privileged status, while providing practical protection for feet that walked on floors inlaid with precious stones from across the known world. The incense that perfumed their quarters came from the fabled land of Punt, that mysterious region somewhere along the African coast that had supplied aromatic resins to Egyptian civilization for over 2 millennia. But Ptolemaic trade networks extended far beyond traditional Egyptian sources to include aromatics from Arabia, India, and even distant China, creating olfactory environments that reflected the global reach of Hellenistic commerce and culture. The peacock feathers that adorned their ceremonial costumes came from India, brought by merchants whose ships followed monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea to ports in the Red Sea before their precious cargoes were transported overland to the Nile and then downriver to Alexandria. These magnificent plumes, with their iridescent colors and distinctive eye patterns, served as symbols of the exotic wealth that Ptolemaic rule had made accessible to Greek civilization. Evening entertainments in the royal apartments often took the form of scholarly discussions that combined intellectual inquiry with social pleasure, as the boundaries between education and entertainment became pleasantly blurred in environments where learning was valued as highly as physical beauty. The court favorites participated in these conversations as both students and teachers, their diverse backgrounds and travels providing perspectives that enriched discussions of poetry, philosophy, history, and science. The palace intrigues that swirled around these scholarly entertainments reflected the political complexities of governing an empire where Greek minorities ruled over Egyptian populations, while competing with rival Hellenistic kingdoms for control of trade routes and strategic territories. The court favorites, their intimate access to royal decision-making making them valuable sources of information, found themselves caught up in conspiracies that could advance their fortunes or destroy their lives, depending on their ability to navigate the treacherous currents of dynastic politics. Sassanian, one of the most successful of these court companions, rose to become chief minister under Ptolemy IV, his influence extending far beyond personal relationships to encompass control over military forces, diplomatic negotiations, and economic policies that affected millions of people throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. His career illustrates both the opportunities and the dangers that awaited those who succeeded in transforming personal charm into political power. Yet Sassanian was also responsible for introducing the practice of poison rumors into Ptolemaic court culture, using accusations of treachery and conspiracy to eliminate rivals while strengthening his own position. This innovation, whether based on real threats or manufactured paranoia, created atmospheres of suspicion that made court life increasingly dangerous for everyone involved in palace politics, including the male favorites whose intimate relationships with royal family members made them natural targets for elimination. The invention of elaborate dining rituals that required the presence of official food tasters reflected these growing fears about assassination, while also creating new ceremonial roles for court favorites whose loyalty was considered beyond question. These young men learned to distinguish between different types of poisons and their symptoms, knowledge that was both practically useful and deeply unsettling in its implications about the nature of court life. The artistic patronage that flourished under Ptolemaic rule created opportunities for court favorites to participate in cultural projects that would outlast their own lives and influence the development of Western civilization. Some became accomplished poets, whose works were preserved in the library alongside the classics of earlier periods. Others patronized sculptors and painters whose creations decorated public buildings throughout Alexandria and the other cities of Ptolemaic Egypt. The famous Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, was partially financed through contributions from court favorites whose wealth had been accumulated through royal favor and successful participation in the international trade networks that made Alexandria prosperous. Their investments in this monumental project reflected both their commitment to the city that had given them opportunities and their understanding that architectural achievements could provide lasting monuments to their own success. Religious life in Ptolemaic Alexandria was as complex and hybrid as every other aspect of court culture, as Greek gods were worshipped alongside Egyptian deities, while new syncretic cults emerged that reflected the multicultural nature of Hellenistic civilization. The court favorites participated in these religious observances as both worshippers and performers, their roles in temple ceremonies serving to legitimize Ptolemaic rule, while providing public displays of the cultural harmony that the dynasty claimed to represent. The cult of Serapis, that artificially created deity who combined aspects of Zeus and Osiris, provided particularly important opportunities for court favorites to demonstrate their loyalty to Ptolemaic religious policies while maintaining connections to both Greek and Egyptian spiritual traditions. The elaborate festivals that celebrated this god created public spectacles where the exotic origins and cultural diversity of court companions could be displayed as evidence of the dynasty's universal appeal. As the evening breeze carried the scent of lotus blossoms and frankincense across the harbor where ships from distant lands waited to be unloaded, these young men would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from scholarly research to intimate companionship, from religious ceremonies to political plotting. Their lives, suspended between the Greek heritage of their rulers and the Egyptian civilization that surrounded them, between intellectual achievement and political intrigue, embodied the possibilities and contradictions of a civilization that sought to unite the ancient world through culture and conquest, while struggling to reconcile the competing claims of tradition and innovation. Peacock Throne Pages, Mauryan, India, 3rd c. BCE. In the vast subcontinent of India, where the sacred Ganges carved its ancient path through landscapes that had witnessed the birth of Buddhism and the flowering of urban civilization, the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta and his successors had created administrative systems of unprecedented sophistication and territorial control that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. At the heart of this empire, in the magnificent capital of Pataliputra, stood the wooden palace whose splendor amazed even Greek ambassadors accustomed to the luxury of Hellenistic courts, and within its walls lived the Antarvasin, the inner palace men whose lives embodied the complex relationship between power, desire, and spiritual duty that characterized Indian civilization. The Arthashastra, that remarkable text on statecraft attributed to Chandragupta's minister Kautilya, provides our most detailed evidence for understanding the role of these palace companions within the broader context of Mauryan political theory and administrative practice. Unlike the casual references to court favorites found in other ancient sources, the Arthashastra treats the management of royal intimacy as a serious aspect of governance that required careful attention to security, protocol, and the psychological needs of rulers whose decisions affected millions of subjects. The wooden palace at Pataliputra was itself a marvel that demonstrated Indian mastery of architectural techniques adapted to local climate and materials. Built on stilts that elevated it above the floodplain of the Ganges, its intricately carved pillars and elaborate rooflines created environments that were both practical and beautiful, providing protection from monsoon rains while allowing cooling breezes to circulate through chambers where the business of empire was conducted amid surroundings of unprecedented luxury and refinement. The Antavasin lived in quarters that were physically separated from the main administrative buildings, but connected through covered walkways that allowed discrete movement between different areas of the palace complex. These residential buildings, like everything else in the Mauryan capital, were constructed from the finest woods available in the subcontinent. Sandalwood from the southern forests, cedar from the Himalayan foothills, teak from the western Ghats, creating olfactory environments that proclaimed royal wealth while serving practical functions in a climate where aromatic woods helped repel insects and mask less pleasant odors. Daily life for these palace companions began with dawn ablutions on the Ghats that lined the Ganges. Those stepped platforms where religious, ritual, and practical necessity combined in ceremonies that connected personal purification with cosmic renewal. The young men learned to perform these rituals with precision that reflected their understanding of Hindu religious principles, their movements choreographed to demonstrate both personal piety and imperial orthodoxy in an empire where divine sanction was essential for political legitimacy. The waters of the Ganges themselves carried sacred significance that transcended mere physical cleansing, as Hindu theology taught that immersion in the holy river could wash away sins and facilitate spiritual transformation. For the Antavasin, these daily ablutions served as reminders of their own moral obligations, while providing opportunities for meditation and prayer that helped them maintain psychological equilibrium amid the pressures of court life. Following these morning rituals, the young men would return to the palace for chess lessons that were far more than mere games, but served as training in strategic thinking that Mauryan political theory considered essential for anyone involved in governance. Indian chess, the ancestor of the game played throughout the world today, was believed to reflect the cosmic principles that governed both military conflict and political administration. Its pieces representing different social classes, whose coordinated movement could achieve victory through superior planning and execution. The Sanskrit recitals that occupied much of their afternoon time required both linguistic skill and deep cultural knowledge, as the great epics and religious texts that formed the core of Indian literary tradition carried meanings that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The Ramayana and Mahabharata were not merely entertaining stories, but contained philosophical teachings, political wisdom, and spiritual guidance that made them essential education for anyone who hoped to understand Indian civilization. Learning to recite these texts with proper pronunciation, rhythm, and emotional expression required years of practice under the guidance of Brahmin teachers whose knowledge of Sanskrit grammar and poetic technique was considered indispensable for understanding the deeper meanings embedded in classical literature. The Antavasin studied not only the words themselves, but also the complex system of comments and interpretations that had grown up around them, developing analytical skills that would serve them well in administrative and diplomatic roles. The security protocols that governed palace life reflected Mauryan understanding of the constant threats that surrounded imperial authority in a diverse empire where regional loyalties might conflict with central control. The Antavasin lived within ring-fenced quarters that were designed to provide both luxury and protection, their daily movements monitored by guards whose presence was disguised as ceremonial attendants, but whose real function was intelligence gathering and threat assessment. The spy networks that Kautilya considered essential for effective governance extended into every aspect of palace life, including the personal relationships of royal family members and their intimate companions. The Antarvasin learned to navigate these surveillance systems while maintaining the appearance of spontaneous affection and loyalty, a delicate balance that required constant attention to the political implications of every word and gesture. Eunuch guards, whose castrated status made them safe confidants, while their administrative training made them effective supervisors, controlled access to the most sensitive areas of the palace complex. These men, often recruited from foreign populations, whose loyalty was secured through material advancement rather than ethnic solidarity, served as intermediaries between the Antarvasin and the broader palace hierarchy, while ensuring that security protocols were maintained without creating atmospheres of obvious suspicion. The moral transformation that occurred during the reign of Emperor Ashoka, following his conversion to Buddhism and proclamation of Dharmic principles as the foundation of imperial policy, created new challenges and opportunities for court companions whose roles had been defined by earlier traditions that emphasized personal loyalty and individual advancement. Ashoka's famous edicts, carved on rocks and pillars throughout the empire, proclaimed new standards of moral behavior that affected everyone associated with royal authority. The Buddhist emphasis on non-violence, compassion, and spiritual development created tensions with court traditions that had been based on different assumptions about the relationship between power, pleasure, and moral responsibility. The Antarvasin found themselves caught between older patterns of courtly behavior and new expectations about ethical conduct that reflected the emperor's evolving understanding of his own spiritual obligations. These changes were not merely theoretical, but had practical implications for daily life within the palace. As Buddhist monks and teachers gained access to court circles, while traditional pleasure-seeking activities were subjected to moral scrutiny that had not existed under previous rulers. The young men learned to participate in Buddhist rituals and study Buddhist texts while maintaining their traditional roles as companions and entertainers. The rock edicts that proclaimed Ashoka's moral principles throughout the empire served as constant reminders that imperial authority was now justified by ethical rather than purely political considerations, creating new standards for evaluating the behavior of everyone associated with royal power. The Antarvasin, their intimate relationships with imperial authority making them visible symbols of court culture, found themselves under increasing pressure to conform to Buddhist ideals of moderate behavior and spiritual development. Religious festivals that celebrated both Hindu and Buddhist traditions created complex ceremonial obligations for court companions who needed to demonstrate competence in multiple spiritual traditions while avoiding any appearance of religious confusion or insincerity. These events often lasted for days and required elaborate preparations that tested both their cultural knowledge and their physical endurance. The artistic patronage that flourished under Mauryan rule, particularly during Ashoka's reign, created opportunities for court favorites to participate in cultural projects that would influence Indian civilization for centuries to come. Some became accomplished musicians whose innovations in ragas and talas enriched classical Indian music. Others supported sculptors and architects whose creations adorned the stupas and monasteries that proclaimed Buddhist principles throughout the empire. The political philosophy that emerged from Mauryan administrative experience, synthesizing Indian traditions with lessons learned from governing a diverse empire, created new concepts of imperial responsibility that affected the role of everyone associated with royal authority. The Antarvasin were expected to understand these political principles and to conduct themselves in ways that supported, rather than undermined, the empire's claim to moral legitimacy. As evening fell over the great capital of Pataliputra, and the sound of temple bells mixed with the calls of merchants closing their shops along the river, these young men would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from intimate conversation to participation in religious ceremonies. that maintained the cosmic order upon which Mauryan authority claimed to depend. Their lives, suspended between pleasure and duty, between individual desire and imperial responsibility, between traditional customs and evolving moral standards, embodied the tensions and possibilities of a civilization that sought to unite temporal power with spiritual wisdom, while governing populations whose diversity reflected the subcontinent's ancient complexity. Jade Harmonies, Han China, Honest, c. BCE. In the 1st century before the Common Era, when the Han dynasty had consolidated its authority over the Middle Kingdom and established patterns of imperial administration that would influence Chinese civilization for over 2 millennia, the Forbidden City at Chang'an represented the pinnacle of ancient luxury and bureaucratic sophistication. Here, within walls that enclosed an area larger than many modern cities, the Son of Heaven ruled over an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia, and his court included institutions for training young men whose lives would be devoted entirely to imperial service and pleasure. The Palace School of 8 Talents was an innovation that reflected Han understanding of the complex skills required for effective court service in an empire whose administrative demands exceeded those of any previous Chinese dynasty. Music, calligraphy, astronomy, mathematics, poetry, dance, ceremonial protocol, and military arts combined to create an educational program that transformed selected youths into perfect courtiers whose accomplishments would reflect credit on imperial authority, while providing practical services that the emperor required for both governance and personal satisfaction. The selection process for this school drew candidates from across the empire, as regional administrators were required to identify young men whose beauty, intelligence, and family backgrounds made them suitable for court service. Unlike the military recruitment that provided soldiers for Han armies, or the examination systems that supplied civil administrators, the palace school specifically sought youths whose aesthetic qualities were as important as their intellectual abilities. Many came from families of minor officials whose loyal service had been noted by provincial governors, their sons offered as tribute that demonstrated both submission to imperial authority and confidence in dynastic stability. Others were recruited from merchant families whose wealth had attracted official attention, their commercial success making them valuable additions to a court that needed to understand economic trends and trade networks that connected China with distant civilizations. The eunuch concubines who emerged from this educational process represented a unique synthesis of administrative competence and intimate companionship that reflected Han innovations in imperial organization. Unlike the palace servants of earlier dynasties, these young men were specifically trained to serve dual functions as both government officials and personal companions, their castrated status ensuring loyalty, while their education made them valuable participants in the complex decision-making processes that governed the empire. The precedent of Zhao Gao, the eunuch minister who had manipulated the succession crisis following the death of the first emperor and briefly controlled the entire Chinese state, cast a long shadow over Han court culture. This historical example demonstrated both the potential power that could be achieved through intimate access to imperial authority and the dangers that such power represented for dynastic stability and imperial legitimacy. Emperor Shang, whose reign marked the height of Han luxury and cultural achievement, surrounded himself with eunuch concubines whose influence extended far beyond personal relationships to encompass control over military appointments, provincial governorships, and the complex patronage networks that held the empire together. These young men learned to navigate between their roles as intimate companions and their responsibilities as administrators, a delicate balance that required sophisticated understanding of both human psychology and political dynamics. The elaborate nighttime summons that brought these eunuch concubines to imperial attention operated through a system of tally sticks that ensured both security and ceremonial propriety. These bamboo tokens, carved with symbols that identified specific individuals and marked with seals that prevented forgery, were delivered by trusted messengers whose discretion was essential for maintaining the privacy that imperial intimacy required. The silk registry that recorded these nocturnal encounters was maintained by senior eunuchs whose administrative experience ensured accurate record-keeping, while their castrated status guaranteed discretion about imperial private life. This documentation served multiple purposes: tracking imperial preferences, ensuring fair rotation among available companions, and providing evidence that could be used to resolve disputes about favor and advancement within the palace hierarchy. The registry itself was a work of art, its silk pages decorated with paintings that celebrated the seasons, and its calligraphy executed by master scribes whose skill transformed administrative necessity into aesthetic achievement. The entries were written in literary Chinese that elevated mundane scheduling into poetic expression, creating documents that served practical functions while reflecting the cultural values that made Han civilization distinctive. Daily life within the palace school followed rhythms that reflected both educational objectives and the ceremonial demands of court culture. Morning lessons in calligraphy, where students learned to write the complex characters that were essential for administrative work, while developing the aesthetic sensibilities that made writing an art form rather than mere communication. The brushes they used were made from the finest wolf hair, their ink prepared from pine soot and gelatin, according to recipes that had been refined over centuries of artistic experimentation. Afternoon astronomical observations, conducted from platforms that provided clear views of the sky above Chang'an, taught these young men to understand the cosmic patterns that Chinese political theory considered essential for effective governance. The movement of stars and planets was believed to reflect the moral condition of imperial rule, making astronomical knowledge a practical necessity for anyone involved in political decision-making. Musical training emphasized not only performance technique, but also the theoretical understanding that connected musical harmony with political order, as Confucian philosophy taught that proper music could maintain social stability, while incorrect musical practices could contribute to dynastic decline. The instruments used in these lessons were masterpieces of craftsmanship whose creation required materials from across the empire: jade from the western mountains, bronze from southern foundries, silk strings from carefully controlled sericulture operations. The jade-plated suits that awaited the most successful eunuch concubines after death represented the ultimate expression of imperial favor, as these burial garments required thousands of individual jade pieces sewn together with gold thread in patterns that reflected both artistic achievement and religious significance. The creation of such suits required years of work by master craftsmen whose skills were among the most prized in Chinese civilization. The symbolism of jade in Chinese culture made these burial suits particularly meaningful, as this precious stone was believed to possess protective properties that could preserve both physical bodies and spiritual essence beyond death. The green color of the finest jade was associated with eternal life and cosmic harmony, making it the perfect material for ensuring that imperial favorites would continue to serve their master in the afterlife. The follow-up careers that successful eunuch concubines could achieve as county governors and provincial administrators reflected Han recognition that intimate knowledge of imperial preferences could be transformed into effective administrative capability. These appointments served multiple purposes: rewarding loyal service, providing experienced administrators for distant provinces, and creating networks of personal loyalty that strengthened imperial control over territories that might otherwise develop regional autonomy. The transition from palace companion to provincial governor required additional training in legal procedures, taxation systems, military organization, and the other practical skills needed for effective administration. This education was provided by experienced officials whose own careers had followed similar trajectories, creating mentorship relationships that ensured continuity of administrative practice, while adapting imperial policies to local conditions. The wealth that successful eunuch governors could accumulate through honest administration or corrupt practices created new social dynamics within Chinese society, as these men used their riches to patronize artists, support religious institutions, and establish charitable foundations that would preserve their memory after death. Their economic activities contributed to the commercial development that made Han China one of the world's most prosperous civilizations. The silk trade routes that connected China with Central Asia and the Roman Empire provided opportunities for eunuch administrators to participate in international commerce while serving imperial diplomatic interests. Their understanding of palace preferences and their access to imperial resources made them valuable intermediaries in negotiations with foreign merchants and diplomats. Religious life within the palace school reflected the complex relationship between Confucian political philosophy, Taoist spiritual practices, and popular religious traditions that characterized Han intellectual culture. The eunuch concubines learned to participate in state rituals that honored imperial ancestors, while maintaining personal spiritual practices that provided psychological support for lives that were often stressful and uncertain. The ancestor worship that formed the core of imperial religious observance required these young men to understand genealogical relationships that connected current rulers with the founders of Chinese civilization, knowledge that was both politically important and spiritually meaningful. Their participation in these ceremonies served to legitimize imperial authority while providing emotional connections with cultural traditions that transcended individual dynastic interests. Palace gardens that recreated natural landscapes in miniature provided settings for both recreational activities and spiritual contemplation, as Chinese aesthetic theory taught that exposure to natural beauty could cultivate moral character while providing relief from the artificial pressures of court life. The eunuch concubines learned to appreciate these environments as both artistic achievements and spiritual resources. The literary culture that flourished within the palace school produced poetry and prose that enriched Chinese literature while providing vehicles for expressing the complex emotions that arose from lives devoted to imperial service. Some of these works were preserved in imperial libraries and influenced later writers who drew inspiration from their exploration of themes related to loyalty, sacrifice, and the relationship between personal desire and public duty. The philosophical discussions that took place during evening gatherings in imperial apartments often focused on questions about the nature of human relationships, the obligations of loyalty, and the possibility of finding personal fulfillment within hierarchical social systems. The eunuch concubines participated in these conversations as both students and teachers, their unique life experiences providing perspectives that enriched intellectual exploration, while their education made them capable participants in serious philosophical inquiry. As night fell over the great capital of Chang'an, and the last court ceremonies concluded with rituals that connected earthly administration with cosmic order, these young men would prepare for duties that might include anything from intimate companionship to administrative consultation, from artistic performance to spiritual guidance. Their lives, suspended between their sacrificed masculinity and their achieved authority, between personal service and public responsibility, embodied the contradictions and possibilities of a civilization that sought to unite individual excellence with collective harmony while maintaining imperial unity across territories whose diversity reflected the ancient complexity of Chinese culture. Marble, purple, early imperial Rome, honest, C.E. In the first century of the Common Era, when Rome had transformed from a Mediterranean city-state into a world empire that stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the Euphrates River, the Palatine Hill overlooked the Forum, where senators debated, while emperors ruled from palaces that rivaled the wonders of the ancient world. Within these marble halls, where purple-striped togas marked the highest ranks of imperial society, lived the cubicularii and deliciae, bedroom attendants and luxury boys, whose lives embodied the complex relationship between Greek cultural influence and Roman political authority. The Domus Transitoria, and later the magnificent Domus Aurea, represented the pinnacle of imperial luxury, their rooms decorated with frescoes that depicted mythological scenes, while their gardens contained exotic plants and animals brought from across the empire. The scale of these buildings was unprecedented in Roman architecture, their construction requiring the labor of thousands of workers and the consumption of materials that demonstrated imperial wealth on a scale that amazed even foreign ambassadors accustomed to Oriental splendor. The cubicularii, who served in these palaces, occupied positions that were both intimate and administrative, their duties extending far beyond personal service to encompass responsibilities that connected them to the complex bureaucratic machinery that governed the Roman world. Unlike the military officers who commanded legions or the senators who administered provinces, these young men operated within the private sphere of imperial authority, where personal relationships and political decisions merged in ways that outsiders could barely comprehend. Many were Greek freedmen whose education and cultural sophistication made them valuable additions to a court that prized intellectual accomplishment alongside physical beauty. The conquest of Greece had brought not only artistic treasures to Rome, but also human resources whose knowledge of philosophy, literature, and the arts enriched imperial court culture, while providing practical skills that were essential for administering an empire that included Greek-speaking populations throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. Antinius of Claudius represents perhaps the most famous example of how Greek cultural background could be transformed into Roman imperial favor, though his career also illustrates the precarious nature of relationships that depended entirely on personal charm and imperial whim. His rise from obscure provincial origins to positions of significant influence within the imperial household demonstrates both the opportunities and the dangers that awaited young men who succeeded in capturing imperial attention. The patronage chains that connected these imperial favorites to broader networks of Roman society were complex systems that linked private relationships to public advancement in ways that were both beneficial and potentially dangerous. A young man who gained imperial favor might use his position to advance the careers of family members, hometown associates, or educational mentors, creating webs of obligation and mutual support that could survive changes in imperial favor, while also creating vulnerabilities if political circumstances shifted. Manumission represented the ultimate goal for most of these young men, as the grant of freedom transformed them from imperial property into Roman citizens whose rights were protected by law rather than dependent on personal relationships. The ceremonies that marked these transitions were themselves significant events that demonstrated imperial generosity, while creating new bonds of obligation between former slaves and their imperial patrons. The legal complexities surrounding manumission reflected broader Roman concerns about the proper relationship between citizenship and service, as the integration of freed slaves into Roman society required careful attention to questions of loyalty, cultural assimilation, and social hierarchy. The former cubicularii who achieved citizenship often became valuable intermediaries between imperial authority and populations whose own relationships to Roman power were similarly complex and evolving. The ban on intact males in imperial apartments represented a practical security measure that reflected Roman understanding of the political dangers that could arise from uncontrolled access to imperial authority. This policy, borrowed from Persian and other Oriental precedents, created the paradoxical situation where the most intimate imperial servants were also the most physically altered, their castration serving as both guarantee of loyalty and symbol of their separation from normal Roman masculinity. The circumvention of Roman castration taboos through operations performed in foreign territories created complex legal and ethical situations that reflected broader tensions between Roman moral traditions and the practical requirements of imperial administration. Young men who underwent these procedures in Egypt, Asia Minor, or other provinces where such practices were legally permissible could then serve in Roman palaces without violating domestic laws, though their status remained morally ambiguous within traditional Roman value systems. The public rumor mills documented by Suetonius in his gossipy biographies of the emperors provide fascinating glimpses into how ordinary Romans understood and interpreted the private lives of their rulers, though these accounts must be read carefully to distinguish between reliable observation and malicious speculation. The very existence of such rumors indicates that imperial private life was a subject of widespread public interest, even though direct knowledge of palace activities was limited to small circles of insiders. The contrast between these lurid public narratives and the everyday routines of actual palace life illustrates the gap between popular imagination and bureaucratic reality that characterized many aspects of Roman imperial culture. While poets and satirists might focus on the most sensational aspects of imperial behavior, the daily experience of cubicularii was more likely to involve mundane administrative tasks, ceremonial duties, and the careful management of personal relationships within a hierarchical system that rewarded loyalty and discretion. The dawn salutatio that began each day in the imperial household was a formal ceremony that demonstrated the complex social relationships that connected the emperor to various levels of Roman society, from senators and generals to freedmen and slaves. The cubicularii participated in these rituals as both servants and symbolic representatives of imperial authority, their presence serving to remind visitors of the intimate access that imperial favor could provide, while also demonstrating the emperor's power to command absolute loyalty from those who served him. The morning routine that followed these public ceremonies often involved private meetings where the emperor reviewed correspondence from provincial governors, military commanders, and other officials whose reports required immediate attention. The cubicularii who attended these sessions learned to understand the complex decision-making processes that governed imperial policy, while maintaining the discretion that was essential for preserving the confidentiality effective administration required. Afternoon entertainments in the imperial gardens provided opportunities for more relaxed interactions that combined pleasure with the informal exchange of information and ideas that was crucial for maintaining effective relationships with the various factions and interest groups that comprised Roman political society. These gatherings often included senators, equestrians, foreign ambassadors, and other dignitaries whose conversations with the emperor could influence policies that affected millions of people throughout the empire. The role of cubicularii in these social events was both visible and discreet, as they provided services that kept the gatherings running smoothly while avoiding any appearance of inappropriate influence over imperial decision-making. Their training emphasized the importance of reading social situations accurately and responding appropriately to subtle cues that indicated when their presence was desired and when they should withdraw to allow private conversations. Evening banquets in the imperial triclinium were elaborate affairs that combined dining with entertainment and political discussion in ways that reflected both Greek symposium traditions and distinctively Roman concerns with hierarchy and protocol. The cubicularii, who served at these events, learned to navigate complex social dynamics while ensuring that every detail of service met the standards of perfection that imperial hospitality required. The luxury that surrounded these banquets was legendary even by Roman standards, with foods imported from across the empire and entertainment provided by performers whose skills represented the best that could be found in the ancient world. The cubicularii participated in these displays of imperial magnificence as both servants and symbols, their presence contributing to atmospheres of exotic luxury, while their beauty and accomplishments reflected credit on imperial taste and authority. The education that prepared these young men for their roles combined practical training in household management with cultural instruction that made them suitable companions for rulers whose interests extended far beyond mere administration, to encompass philosophy, literature, art, and science. They learned to read and write in both Latin and Greek, to understand the historical and mythological references that filled educated Roman conversation, and to participate intelligently in discussions of contemporary political and cultural issues. The libraries that were attached to imperial palaces provided both resources for this education and venues for the intellectual activities that occupied leisure hours when ceremonial duties were completed. The cubicularii often served as research assistants for imperial literary projects, while pursuing their own studies in subjects that ranged from natural philosophy to poetry to military engineering. The artistic patronage that flourished in imperial Rome created opportunities for talented cubicularii to participate in cultural projects that would influence Western civilization for centuries to come. Some became accomplished poets whose works were preserved alongside those of famous authors like Virgil and Ovid. Others supported painters, sculptors, and architects whose creations decorated public buildings throughout Rome and the provinces. The religious life of the imperial court was as complex as every other aspect of palace culture, as traditional Roman practices were enriched by influences from across the empire, while new cults emerged that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of imperial society. The cubicularii learned to participate in state rituals that honored traditional Roman gods while maintaining personal spiritual practices that provided psychological support for lives that were often stressful and uncertain. The mystery religions that attracted many Romans during this period offered alternative spiritual communities that transcended conventional social boundaries, creating opportunities for relationships and activities that were separate from the hierarchical structures that governed palace life. Some cubicularii became initiates in the cults of Mithras, Isis, or other deities whose worship provided both spiritual satisfaction and social networks that could survive changes in imperial favor. The medical knowledge that was essential for maintaining health in environments where disease could spread rapidly among closely quartered populations made some cubicularii valuable as informal physicians whose understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and therapeutic techniques supplemented the services provided by professional doctors. Their intimate knowledge of imperial health concerns also made them important participants in the security measures that protected emperors from assassination attempts through poisoning or other medical means. As evening shadows lengthened across the 7 hills of Rome, and the last public ceremonies concluded with rituals that connected earthly administration with divine authority, these young men would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from intimate companionship to administrative consultation, from artistic performance to intelligence gathering. Their lives, suspended between slavery and citizenship, between Greek culture and Roman power, between private service and public responsibility, embodied the contradictions and possibilities of an empire that sought to unite the ancient world through military conquest and cultural assimilation, while maintaining imperial unity across territories whose diversity reflected the complexity of Mediterranean civilization. Singing silk veils. Byzantine court, 6th CC. In the 6th century of the Common Era, when the Eastern Roman Empire had evolved into something that historians would later call Byzantium, the court at Constantinople represented a fascinating synthesis of Roman imperial traditions, Greek cultural heritage, and Christian theological innovation. Within the Great Palace, whose complex of buildings sprawled across the hills, overlooking the Bosphorus where Europe and Asia met in waters that reflected the domes of Hagia Sophia, lived eunuch courtiers whose lives embodied the transformation of classical antiquity into medieval Christendom. The Magnora School, that famous institution where eunuch pages received their education, was more than an academy, but rather a complete system for transforming young men into perfect servants of imperial authority and Christian orthodoxy. Here, in chambers decorated with mosaics showing Christ Pantocrator blessing imperial rule, students learned the complex skills required for service in a court that combined ancient ceremonial traditions with the theological requirements of a Christian empire. The curriculum at Magnora emphasized not only practical administrative skills, but also the theological knowledge that was essential for participating in a court culture where religious orthodoxy was considered as important as political loyalty. Students learned to read and write in both Greek and Latin, to understand the complex relationships between imperial law and Christian doctrine, and to participate intelligently in the theological discussions that often determined imperial policy on issues ranging from taxation to military strategy. Hymn-chanting duties in Hagia Sophia connected these eunuch courtiers to the spiritual heart of Byzantine civilization, as their voices joined with those of the cathedral clergy in creating musical environments that were believed to echo the angelic choirs of heaven itself. The acoustic properties of Justinian's great church had been carefully calculated to enhance vocal music, its vast dome and marble surfaces creating reverberations that transformed human voices into supernatural sounds. The musical education required for these liturgical duties was extremely sophisticated, involving not only technical training in vocal production, but also deep understanding of the theological meanings embedded in Byzantine chant traditions. Each hymn carried specific doctrinal content, its melodies and rhythms designed to reinforce orthodox teaching, while creating emotional experiences that strengthened the faithful's commitment to imperial authority and Christian truth. The ceremonial processions that marked important religious festivals provided public venues where the eunuch courtiers could display both their musical abilities and their symbolic significance as representatives of imperial authority. These events often involved thousands of participants whose coordinated movements through the streets of Constantinople created spectacular displays that impressed both domestic and foreign observers with the wealth and organizational capability of Byzantine civilization. The perfumed fans that eunuch courtiers carried during these processions were not merely ceremonial objects, but functional tools that served practical purposes in crowded urban environments where the scent of incense needed to be directed and controlled. The fans themselves were works of art, their ivory handles carved by master craftsmen and their silk surfaces painted with religious imagery that proclaimed Byzantine theological principles while serving aesthetic functions. The rank colors displayed on Lauros sashes created visual hierarchies that made the complex social relationships of Byzantine court life immediately apparent to observers who understood the symbolic significance of different hues and patterns. Purple, reserved for the imperial family itself, was surrounded by gradations of blue, green, red, and gold that marked various levels of court rank while creating spectacular visual effects during ceremonial events. The silk used for these garments came from imperial workshops whose production was carefully controlled to ensure both quality and exclusivity, as Byzantine silk was considered the finest in the medieval world, and its export was regulated to maintain diplomatic and economic advantages over rival powers. The designs woven into these precious textiles often incorporated religious symbols, imperial monograms, and decorative patterns that proclaimed Byzantine cultural achievement while serving practical functions as status markers. The story of Narses provides perhaps the most remarkable example of how a eunuch courtier could transform personal relationships with imperial authority into achievements that influenced the course of history itself. Born in Armenia and brought to Constantinople as a young man, he rose through court service to become one of Justinian's most trusted generals. his military campaigns in Italy restoring Byzantine control over territories that had been lost to barbarian conquest. The apparent contradiction between Narses' intimate court relationships and his success as a military commander illustrates the complex ways that Byzantine culture understood the relationship between physical alteration and personal capability. His castration, rather than limiting his potential for achievement, actually enhanced his value as a general by ensuring that his loyalty was focused entirely on imperial rather than dynastic interests. The hospitals that Narses built using wealth accumulated through imperial favor represent another dimension of his remarkable career, as these institutions served both practical medical functions and symbolic purposes that demonstrated the connection between imperial service and Christian charity. These buildings, constructed according to architectural principles that emphasized both functionality and beauty, provided care for the sick and poor, while proclaiming the moral legitimacy of Byzantine imperial authority. The military engineering innovations that Narses introduced during his Italian campaigns reflected knowledge that he had acquired through court service, as Byzantine palaces were treasure houses of technical information gathered from across the empire and beyond. His siege techniques, fortification designs, and logistical systems combined traditional Roman military knowledge with innovations borrowed from Persian, Arab, and other sources that made Byzantine armies more effective than their barbarian opponents. The diplomatic skills that made Narses valuable as both a courtier and a general were products of his multicultural education and his experience navigating the complex relationships that characterized Byzantine court life. His ability to negotiate with Lombard kings, Gothic nobles, and papal officials reflected training that emphasized cultural sensitivity and psychological insight alongside military and administrative competence. Daily life for eunuch courtiers at the Byzantine court followed rhythms that reflected both the ceremonial demands of Christian imperial culture and the administrative requirements of governing an empire that faced constant military threats from multiple directions. Morning prayers in palace chapels, where relics of saints and martyrs created sacred environments that connected earthly service with heavenly authority. Afternoon lessons in theology, law, and administration that prepared them for roles that might require anything from diplomatic negotiation to military planning. Evening entertainments that combined intellectual discussion with carefully regulated social interaction, as Byzantine court culture sought to maintain the sophistication of classical traditions while conforming to Christian moral standards that discouraged the excesses that had characterized pagan imperial courts. These gatherings often focused on theological questions whose resolution could have important implications for imperial policy on issues ranging from taxation to military recruitment. The palace workshops where eunuch courtiers learned artistic skills that made them valuable participants in the cultural projects that proclaimed Byzantine achievement to both domestic and foreign audiences. Manuscript illumination, silk weaving, ivory carving, and metalwork required technical abilities that took years to develop, while also demanding aesthetic sensibilities that reflected deep understanding of both classical and Christian artistic traditions. The library collections that were maintained within the Great Palace provided resources for both practical administration and scholarly research, as Byzantine culture placed enormous value on preserving and transmitting the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity while adapting it to serve Christian purposes. The eunuch courtiers often served as librarians and scribes, whose work ensured that important texts were preserved for future generations while making them accessible for contemporary use. The intelligence networks that connected Constantinople to distant provinces and foreign courts relied heavily on eunuch agents whose linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge made them effective gatherers of information that was crucial for imperial decision-making. Their reports on military developments, economic conditions, and political situations in various parts of the empire provided the raw material for policy decisions that could affect millions of people. The religious controversies that periodically convulsed Byzantine society often involved eunuch courtiers as both participants and victims, as their intimate access to imperial authority made them valuable allies for competing theological factions, while also making them vulnerable to persecution when imperial religious policies changed. The iconoclastic controversies that dominated 8th and 9th century Byzantine history created particularly dangerous situations for court eunuchs whose careers had been built around participation in artistic and ceremonial activities that iconoclastic emperors considered theologically suspect. The international marriages that connected Byzantine imperial family members to foreign royal houses often required the services of eunuch courtiers whose cultural knowledge and diplomatic skills made them valuable intermediaries in negotiations that could determine the success or failure of important alliances. Their participation in these diplomatic activities reflected both their value as trusted agents and their safety as marriage negotiators, whose castrated status made them immune to suspicions about inappropriate relationships with foreign Greece. Princesses. The monastic retirement that concluded many eunuch careers provided both spiritual fulfillment and practical security for men whose court service had made them wealthy, while also creating political vulnerabilities that could become dangerous when imperial favor shifted to new favorites. The monasteries that specialized in housing former court officials created communities where religious devotion and worldly experience combined to produce institutions that served important social and cultural functions within Byzantine society. As night fell over Constantinople and the last evening prayers echoed through Hagia Sophia, while oil lamps flickered in palace chambers where silk hangings created intimate spaces within vast imperial buildings, these eunuch courtiers would prepare for duties that might include anything from theological discussion to administrative consultation, from artistic creation to intelligence analysis. Their lives, suspended between classical traditions and Christian innovation, between personal service and public responsibility, between earthly ambition and spiritual aspiration, embodied the contradictions and possibilities of a civilization that sought to preserve the achievements of the ancient world while adapting them to serve medieval Christian purposes. Scepter. Sandalwood. Sassanian Persia. 6th CEC. In the 6th century of the Common Era, when the Sassanian Empire had reached the zenith of its power and cultural achievement, the royal court at Ctesiphon represented the last flowering of ancient Persian civilization before the Arab conquests would transform the Middle East forever. Within the magnificent palace complex whose spiral columns supported vaulted halls that amazed foreign ambassadors, lived the Ghulamzada, palace pages whose lives embodied the sophisticated synthesis of Persian, Mesopotamian, and Hellenistic traditions that made Sassanian culture one of the most refined in the ancient world. The architectural setting for their daily lives was itself a masterpiece that demonstrated Persian engineering skill and aesthetic achievement on a scale that rivaled the great monuments of antiquity. The spiral columns that supported the palace halls were unique innovations that combined structural functionality with decorative beauty, their helical forms creating visual effects that transformed architectural space into artistic experience, while providing practical support for roof structures that enclosed vast areas without internal supports. The Take Khasra, or Arch of Khosrow, whose ruins still rise majestically from the Iraqi desert, was the centerpiece of this architectural complex. Its unprecedented span, demonstrating mastery of engineering techniques that would not be equaled in Europe for centuries to come. The palace chambers that surrounded this great hall were decorated with stucco reliefs, silk hangings, and precious metalwork that created environments of unprecedented luxury and refinement. The Ghulamzada, who lived within these magnificent buildings, came from diverse backgrounds that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Sassanian court culture. Many were recruited from noble families in the various provinces of the empire, their service representing both a form of prestigious education and a subtle form of hostage-taking that ensured the loyalty of regional elites. Others came from beyond the imperial borders, captives taken in the endless wars with Byzantium, or tribute offerings from Central Asian peoples who sought Persian protection against more dangerous enemies. The training in chess, or shetrang as it was known in Middle Persian, was far more than recreational activity, but represented education in strategic thinking that Persian political theory considered essential for anyone involved in governance or military command. Sassanian chess was more complex than its modern descendant, with additional pieces and rules that reflected the hierarchical nature of Persian society, while providing intellectual challenges that developed analytical skills. The poetry of Khosrow that formed a crucial part of their literary education represented the pinnacle of Sassanian cultural achievement, as these works synthesized Persian mythological traditions with contemporary courtly values in verses that were considered among the finest ever created in any language. Learning to recite these poems with proper pronunciation and emotional expression required years of study under master teachers whose own education connected them to literary traditions that stretched back to the earliest periods of Persian civilization. The polo matches played on royal fields provided both physical exercise and opportunities for displaying the horsemanship that Persian culture considered one of the most important aristocratic accomplishments. Persian polo was the ancestor of the modern game, but its original form was more complex and dangerous, involving larger teams and rules that emphasized both individual skill and collective coordination in ways that were believed to reflect the qualities needed for military command. The horses used in these games were themselves marvels of selective breeding that represented centuries of Persian expertise in developing animal bloodlines that combined speed, endurance, and intelligence in proportions that made them superior to any horses available to rival civilizations. The care and training of these animals required specialized knowledge that the Ghulam Zada learned alongside their other accomplishments. The castration laws implemented under Khosrow reflected Sassanian attempts to balance the practical advantages of eunuch service with Zoroastrian religious principles that emphasized the natural order and the importance of fertility for cosmic harmony. These regulations created complex legal and theological situations that required careful interpretation by religious authorities who needed to reconcile imperial administrative needs with orthodox religious doctrine. The Zoroastrian purity debates that surrounded these practices illustrate the sophisticated theological discussions that characterized Sassanian religious culture, as priests and scholars developed arguments that attempted to justify necessary political practices within the framework of religious orthodoxy. These debates were not merely academic exercises, but had practical implications for the legal status and social acceptance of eunuch courtiers whose service was essential for imperial administration. The fire temples that were central to Zoroastrian religious practice provided venues for ceremonies that connected the Ghulam Zada to the spiritual foundations of Persian imperial authority, as their participation in these rituals demonstrated both personal piety and political loyalty. The eternal flames that burned in these temples were believed to represent the divine light of Ahura Mazda, making them focal points for religious observances that reinforced the cosmic order that Persian kings claimed to represent on earth. Daily routines within the palace complex followed patterns that reflected both the ceremonial demands of Sassanian court culture and the practical requirements of administering an empire that stretched from the Caucasus to the Arabian Sea. Morning ablutions in chambers, where rosewater and other aromatic essences created olfactory environments that proclaimed Persian luxury while serving practical functions in a climate where personal cleanliness was both health necessity and religious obligation. Afternoon lessons in various subjects that ranged from astronomy and mathematics to music and poetry, as Sassanian education emphasized the comprehensive cultural knowledge that was considered necessary for effective court service. the teachers who provided this instruction were themselves products of a sophisticated educational system that preserved and transmitted the intellectual heritage of Persian civilization while adapting it to serve contemporary needs. Evening entertainments that often took the form of elaborate banquets where food, music, poetry, and conversation combined to create social environments that strengthened the personal relationships that were crucial for maintaining imperial unity in a diverse empire. These gatherings provided opportunities for informal political discussion, while also serving ceremonial functions that demonstrated imperial wealth and cultural achievement to foreign ambassadors and domestic audiences. The cuisine served at these banquets represented the pinnacle of Persian culinary art, combining ingredients from across the empire and beyond in dishes that were both aesthetically pleasing and symbolically meaningful. Rice from the northern provinces, spices from India, wines from the western regions, and exotic delicacies from distant trade routes were combined according to recipes that had been refined over centuries of cultural exchange and artistic experimentation. The musical performances that accompanied these meals featured instruments and compositions that synthesized Persian traditional music with influences from Greek, Arab, and Central Asian sources, creating new forms of artistic expression that reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Sassanian court culture. The Ghulamzada learned to play various instruments while also developing vocal techniques that allowed them to participate in both solo performances and ensemble presentations. The administrative responsibilities that some Ghulamzada eventually assumed required knowledge of the complex legal and bureaucratic systems that governed the Sassanian Empire, as their intimate access to royal authority made them valuable participants in decision-making processes that affected millions of subjects. Their training emphasized not only technical administrative skills, but also the cultural sensitivity needed for governing populations whose ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity reflected the empire's vast territorial extent. The diplomatic missions that occasionally took Ghulamzada to foreign courts provided opportunities for demonstrating Persian cultural achievement while gathering intelligence about potential enemies and allies. Their reports on Byzantine court life, Central Asian political developments, and Indian commercial opportunities provided valuable information for imperial policy-making, while also contributing to the cultural exchange that enriched Sassanian civilization. The artistic patronage that flourished under Sassanian rule created opportunities for talented Ghulamzada to participate in cultural projects that would influence Persian and Islamic art for centuries to come. Rock reliefs, silverwork, textiles, and manuscript illumination reached unprecedented levels of achievement during this period, with court patrons supporting artists whose creations proclaimed Sassanian cultural superiority while preserving artistic traditions for future generations. The religious syncretism that characterized later Sassanian period created complex spiritual environments where Zoroastrian orthodoxy coexisted with Manichaean, Christian, and Buddhist influences that reflected the empire's position as a crossroads between different civilizations. The Ghulamzada learned to navigate these religious complexities while maintaining the Zoroastrian piety that was officially required for court service. The library collections that were maintained within the palace complex preserved texts in multiple languages and scripts, as Sassanian scholars sought to gather and preserve the intellectual heritage of all the civilizations that had contributed to Persian culture. The Ghulamzada often served as copyists and translators, whose work ensured that important texts remained accessible while also contributing to scholarly projects that advanced human knowledge. The medical knowledge that was essential for maintaining health in palace environments led some Ghulamzada to specialize in therapeutic techniques that combined traditional Persian healing practices with innovations borrowed from Greek, Indian, and other medical traditions. Their understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and diagnostic procedures made them valuable members of palace medical staff, while also providing skills that could be useful in diplomatic and military contexts. As evening settled over the great capital of Ctesiphon, and the last administrative business was concluded in chambers, where silk wall hangings created intimate spaces within vast imperial buildings, these palace pages would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from intimate companionship to participation in religious ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order upon which Sassanian authority claimed to depend. Their lives, suspended between Persian tradition and foreign influence, between temporal service and spiritual obligation, between individual accomplishment and imperial loyalty, embodied the sophisticated cultural synthesis that made the Sassanian Empire the last great expression of ancient Persian civilization. Lotus-fringed balconies, Gupta, India, 5th CCE. In the 5th century of the Common Era, when the Gupta Empire had ushered in what historians would later call the Golden Age of Indian civilization, the royal courts that flourished in cities like Pataliputra and Ujjain represented unprecedented achievements in artistic, intellectual, and cultural development. Within palace complexes, whose architecture synthesized indigenous Indian traditions with influences from the Hellenistic kingdoms that had once ruled in the northwest, lived male companions whose lives embodied the sophisticated relationship between power, pleasure, and spiritual development that characterized classical Indian civilization. The courtly Kamashastra etiquette that governed the behavior of these male companions was not merely a set of arbitrary rules, but represented a comprehensive philosophy of human relationships that sought to harmonize physical pleasure with moral development and social responsibility. The texts that codified these practices, most famously the Kama Sutra of Vatsyayana, provided detailed guidance for conducting intimate relationships in ways that enhanced rather than diminished the spiritual and ethical development of all participants. This philosophical approach to intimate companionship reflected broader Indian cultural values that emphasized the integration of different aspects of human experience rather than their separation into conflicting categories. The classical Indian concept of the four Purusharthas, or life goals: dharma, righteousness; artha, material prosperity; kama, pleasure; and moksha, spiritual liberation, provided frameworks for understanding how physical relationships could contribute to, rather than detract from, spiritual and moral achievement. The male companions who served in Gupta courts were expected to master not only the physical arts of pleasure, but also the intellectual and aesthetic accomplishments that made them suitable participants in the sophisticated cultural life that flourished under imperial patronage. Their education encompassed literature, music, dance, painting, philosophy, and various practical skills that were considered essential for anyone who hoped to move successfully within court circles. The painting lessons that took place in chambers near the famous Ajanta caves represented connections to one of the most remarkable artistic achievements in human history, as these rock-cut monasteries contained frescoes whose beauty and technical sophistication would influence Indian art for centuries to come. The techniques learned in palace workshops were often applied to religious as well as secular subjects, creating artistic traditions that served both courtly entertainment and spiritual instruction. The pigments used in these painting lessons came from sources throughout the Indian subcontinent and beyond, as Gupta trade networks extended from Southeast Asia to the Mediterranean, providing access to materials that allowed artists to achieve effects of unprecedented brilliance and durability. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cinnabar from China, and various plant and mineral dyes from local sources were combined, according to formulae that had been refined through generations of artistic experimentation. The monsoon rooftop concerts that provided entertainment during the rainy season created musical environments that celebrated both natural beauty and human artistic achievement. As musicians performed on terraces where the sound of rain combined with instrumental music to create atmospheric effects that enhance the emotional impact of poetic and musical compositions. These performances often featured ragas that were specifically associated with monsoon themes, their melodic and rhythmic patterns designed to evoke the complex emotions that Indians associated with the arrival of seasonal rains. The Indian classical music that was performed during these concerts represented one of the most sophisticated musical systems ever developed, with theoretical foundations that connected mathematical relationships to spiritual principles, while providing frameworks for improvisation that allowed individual performers to express personal creativity within traditional structures. The male companions learned to play various instruments, while also developing vocal techniques that prepared them for both solo and ensemble performances. The sandalwood scripts that were used for literary exercises combined practical writing instruction with exposure to aromatic substances that were believed to enhance mental clarity and spiritual awareness, as Indian philosophical traditions often emphasize the importance of environmental factors in educational and artistic activities. The preparation of these writing materials required specialized knowledge of botanical sources and processing techniques that connected literary education to broader understanding of natural sciences. The literature that was studied during these educational sessions included both classical Sanskrit texts and contemporary works that reflected the cultural flowering that characterized the Gupta period. Epic poetry, dramatic works, philosophical treatises, and technical manuals provided comprehensive exposure to the intellectual heritage of Indian civilization, while also demonstrating contemporary artistic and scholarly achievements. The Buddhist and Hindu perspectives on palace intimacy created complex theological environments where different religious traditions offered sometimes conflicting guidance about the proper relationship between physical pleasure and spiritual development. Buddhist monasticism generally discouraged sexual activity as a distraction from spiritual progress, while Hindu Tantrism developed elaborate theories about how sexual energy could be channeled to enhance rather than impede spiritual advancement. These theological complexities required the male companions to develop sophisticated understanding of religious philosophy, while also learning to navigate the practical challenges of maintaining personal spiritual development within environments that were focused primarily on worldly rather than otherworldly concerns. Some became serious students of religious texts and practices, while others adopted more conventional approaches to religious observance that satisfied social expectations without necessarily representing deep personal commitment. The temple architecture that flourished during the Gupta period provided venues for religious ceremonies that connected court life to broader spiritual traditions, as the elaborate carvings and sculptures that decorated these buildings often depicted scenes that celebrated both divine love and human relationships. The male companions learned to participate in temple rituals, while also understanding the artistic and architectural achievements that made these buildings important cultural monuments. The philosophical discussions that took place in palace gardens often focused on questions about the relationship between individual pleasure and social responsibility, as classical Indian political theory emphasized the importance of royal behavior as a model for broader social conduct. The concept of Raja Dharma, or the righteous duty of kings, provided frameworks for evaluating royal actions that had implications for everyone associated with court life. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was essential for conducting religious ceremonies and determining auspicious times for various activities required specialized education that connected practical skills to broader understanding of cosmic principles that Indian civilization considered fundamental to proper living. The male companions learned to use various calculation methods and observational techniques, while also understanding the philosophical significance of numerical and celestial relationships. The medical knowledge that was considered part of comprehensive education included understanding of Ayurvedic principles that connected physical health to spiritual well-being, as Indian medical traditions emphasized the importance of maintaining balance between different bodily systems and environmental factors. This knowledge was both practically useful for maintaining personal health and valuable for providing care to others within the palace community. The trade relationships that connected Gupta India to civilizations throughout Asia and beyond created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched court life, while also providing economic foundations for the artistic and intellectual brand. Achievements that characterized this period. The male companions often served as intermediaries in these commercial and cultural relationships, their linguistic abilities and cultural knowledge making them valuable participants in diplomatic and economic activities. The artistic workshops that were maintained within palace complexes provided venues for both education and production, as the male companions learned various craft techniques, while also contributing to the creation of objects that served both practical and ceremonial functions. Metalwork, textile production, jewelry making, and other specialized skills required years of training while also providing valuable trade commodities. The seasonal festivals that marked important religious and agricultural cycles created opportunities for elaborate celebrations that combined entertainment with spiritual observance. As the male companions participated in ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies while also celebrating the natural rhythms that governed Indian agricultural and religious life. These events often lasted for days and required extensive preparation and coordination. The garden design that characterized Gupta palace architecture created outdoor environments that served both aesthetic and practical functions, as these carefully planned landscapes provided venues for various activities, while also demonstrating mastery of horticultural techniques that transformed natural materials into artistic expressions. The lotus pools that were central features of these gardens provided both visual beauty and symbolic content related to spiritual development. As evening breezes carried the scent of jasmine and sandalwood across palace courtyards, where oil lamps flickered among lotus pools and peacocks called from garden walls, these male companions would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from intimate relationships to participation in religious ceremonies that connected earthly pleasure with cosmic harmony. Their lives, suspended between physical and spiritual development, between individual advancement and social responsibility, between classical traditions and contemporary innovations, embodied the sophisticated cultural synthesis that made the Gupta period the high point of classical Indian civilization. Pearl-draped nightingales, Tang, China, 8th CCE. In the 8th century of the Common Era, when the Tang dynasty had transformed Chang'an into the largest city in the world and created an empire that stretched from Korea to Central Asia, the imperial court represented the pinnacle of East Asian civilization and cultural achievement. Within the Daming Palace, whose vast courtyards could accommodate tens of thousands of people during state ceremonies, lived eunuch courtiers whose lives embodied the cosmopolitan sophistication that made Tang China a beacon of culture and learning for peoples throughout Asia and beyond. The voice bureau that selected these palace companions represented one of the most sophisticated talent recruitment systems ever developed, as Tang administrators understood that the intimate nature of court service required not only physical beauty, but also cultural accomplishments that could provide intellectual stimulation and emotional satisfaction for rulers whose responsibilities encompassed governing populations that numbered in the tens of millions. The selection process involved multiple stages of evaluation that tested not only vocal abilities, but also general education, artistic talents, and personal characteristics that indicated suitability for court life. Candidates came from throughout the empire and beyond, as Tang trade networks and diplomatic relationships brought young men from Korea, Japan, Central Asia, and other regions whose exotic origins added to their appeal, while their diverse cultural backgrounds enriched court life with perspectives that reflected the international nature of Tang civilization. Many were recruited from families of minor officials whose loyal service had been noted by provincial administrators, while others were identified through the examination systems that provided pathways for advancement based on merit rather than birth. The training to sing poems of Li Bai represented education in one of the greatest literary achievements in human history, as the poetry that flourished during the Tang period combined technical mastery with emotional depth and philosophical insight in ways that influenced Chinese literature for centuries to come. Li Bai's verses, with their celebration of natural beauty, friendship, and the transient nature of human existence, provided perfect material for vocal performance that could create atmospheric effects, ranging from intimate contemplation to elaborate public entertainment. The musical education required for these performances was extremely sophisticated, involving not only vocal technique but also deep understanding of the theoretical principles that connected musical expression to poetic meaning and emotional communication. Tang music synthesized Chinese traditional forms with influences from Central Asia, India, and other regions, creating new styles of composition and performance that reflected the international character of the empire while maintaining distinctively Chinese aesthetic principles. The palace makeup that transformed these young men into living works of art involved cosmetic techniques that had been refined through centuries of court culture, as Tang aesthetic standards emphasized artificial enhancement of natural beauty through methods that created dramatic visual effects, while also serving practical functions in climates where sun exposure and dust could damage skin and hair. Lead white face powder, despite its eventual health consequences, created the pale complexions that were considered essential for courtly beauty. The cloud pattern robes that were worn for formal occasions were masterpieces of textile art whose creation required collaboration between silk weavers, dyers, and embroiderers whose skills represented the pinnacle of Chinese craft traditions. The designs incorporated motifs that carried both aesthetic and symbolic meanings, with cloud patterns representing heavenly connections, while color combinations proclaimed the wearer's rank within the complex hierarchies that governed palace life. The peacock down fans that completed these elaborate costumes were both functional tools and artistic objects, their creation requiring feathers from birds that were imported from Southeast Asia through trade networks that connected Tang China to the Indian Ocean commercial system. The fans served practical purposes in palace environments where air circulation was often inadequate for comfort, while also providing opportunities for graceful gestures that enhanced the visual impact of court ceremonies. The political influence achieved by eunuchs like Li Fuguo illustrates both the opportunities and the dangers that accompanied intimate access to imperial authority, as his career demonstrates how personal relationships could be transformed into administrative power that affected the governance of the entire empire. His rise from palace companion to chief minister shows the potential for advancement that existed within Tang court culture, while his eventual downfall illustrates the precarious nature of political power that depended entirely on imperial favor. Li Fuguo's control over military appointments, provincial governorships, and financial policies during his period of greatest influence affected millions of people throughout the Tang territories, as his decisions about taxation, public works projects, and diplomatic relationships had consequences that extended far beyond the palace walls where his power originated. His career exemplifies the complex relationship between personal intimacy and public authority that characterized eunuch involvement in imperial administration. The Anlushan rebellion that devastated Tang China during the mid-8th century had profound implications for the role of eunuch courtiers within imperial administration, as the military crisis that threatened the dynasty's survival created opportunities for some eunuchs to demonstrate loyalty and competence, while also exposing others to suspicion and persecution. The rebellion's causes and consequences illustrate the complex relationship between central authority and regional autonomy that plagued Tang administration throughout its later periods. The impact of this rebellion on eunuch power was complex and contradictory, as the military emergency simultaneously created opportunities for advancement and reasons for suspicion that would influence imperial policy toward palace eunuchs for centuries to come. Some eunuchs distinguished themselves through loyal service during the crisis, while others were suspected of disloyalty or incompetence that contributed to the dynasty's difficulties. The mandated meditation tapestries that were installed in imperial sleeping chambers represent fascinating intersections between Buddhist spiritual practices and palace luxury, as these textile artworks were designed to provide visual environments that would encourage peaceful sleep while also demonstrating imperial commitment to Buddhist religious principles. The creation of these tapestries required collaboration between religious advisors who understood meditation techniques and artists who could translate spiritual concepts into visual forms. The designs incorporated in these meditation aids drew on both Chinese Buddhist traditions and influences from Indian and Central Asian sources, creating synthetic artistic styles that reflected the international character of Tang Buddhism, while serving practical functions related to imperial health and spiritual development. The use of specific colors, patterns, and symbolic motifs was carefully calculated to create psychological effects that would enhance rest and spiritual contemplation. Daily life for these eunuch courtiers followed rhythms that reflected both the ceremonial demands of Tang court culture and the practical requirements of administering an empire whose complexity exceeded that of any previous Chinese dynasty. Morning lessons in various subjects that ranged from classical literature to contemporary poetry, from musical performance to administrative skills, as Tang education emphasized comprehensive cultural knowledge that prepared palace servants for roles that might require anything from entertainment to diplomatic negotiation. Afternoon rehearsals for court performances that might include anything from intimate musical presentations to elaborate spectacles involving hundreds of participants, as Tang court culture valued both subtle artistic expression and magnificent public displays that demonstrated imperial wealth and cultural achievement. These rehearsals required coordination between musicians, dancers, costume designers, and stage managers, whose collective efforts created entertainment experiences that amazed both domestic and foreign audiences. Evening duties that varied according to imperial preferences and ceremonial requirements, as the eunuch courtiers needed to be prepared for anything from scholarly discussion to intimate companionship, from participation in religious ceremonies to assistance with administrative tasks that required discretion and cultural sensitivity. Their training emphasized flexibility and adaptability, while also developing specialized skills that made each individual valuable for particular purposes. The international character of Tang court culture created opportunities for cultural exchange that enriched Chinese civilization, while also providing the eunuch courtiers with knowledge and perspectives that were valuable for diplomatic and commercial activities. Korean, Japanese, Central Asian, and other foreign influences were integrated into court life in ways that created new synthesis of traditions, while maintaining distinctively Chinese cultural identity. The palace workshops where eunuch courtiers learned various artistic and craft skills provided both education and production facilities, as these young men contributed to the creation of objects that served both practical and ceremonial functions, while also developing abilities that could be useful in later careers. Calligraphy, painting, metalwork, and textile production required specialized knowledge that connected artistic expression to broader understanding of cultural traditions and technical processes. The library collections that were maintained within the palace complex provided resources for both practical administration and scholarly research, as Tang culture placed enormous value on preserving and transmitting intellectual heritage, while also encouraging innovations that advanced human knowledge. The eunuch courtiers often served as librarians and copyists, whose work ensured that important texts remained accessible, while also contributing to scholarly projects that enriched Chinese intellectual life. The religious activities that formed part of court life reflected the complex theological environment that characterized Tang China, where Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted in ways that created rich spiritual resources, while also generating theological tensions that sometimes had political implications. The eunuch courtiers learned to participate in various religious observances, while maintaining the doctrinal flexibility that was necessary for navigating these complex spiritual environments. The economic activities that connected palace life to broader commercial networks provided opportunities for some eunuch courtiers to participate in trade relationships that extended throughout Asia and beyond, as their cultural knowledge and linguistic abilities made them valuable intermediaries in international commerce. Their involvement in these activities reflected both personal interest in material advancement and imperial need for intelligence about economic conditions in distant regions. The artistic patronage that flourished under Tang rule created opportunities for talented eunuch courtiers to support cultural projects that would influence East Asian civilization for centuries to come, as their wealth and cultural knowledge made them important participants in the artistic and literary achievements that characterized this period. Poetry, painting, sculpture, and music reached unprecedented levels of achievement with support from court patrons who understood the relationship between artistic excellence and cultural prestige. As night fell over the great capital of Chang'an, and the last court ceremonies concluded with rituals that connected earthly administration with cosmic order, these pearl-draped courtiers would prepare for duties that might include anything from intimate companionship to artistic performance, from administrative consultation to spiritual guidance. Their lives, suspended between Chinese tradition and international influence, between individual accomplishment and imperial service, between earthly pleasure and spiritual development, embodied the sophisticated cultural synthesis that made the Tang dynasty one of the greatest achievements in human civilization. Rose-scented shadows. Abbasid Baghdad, 9th CE. In the 9th century of the Common Era, when the Abbasid Caliphate had transformed Baghdad into the greatest city in the Islamic world and created an empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia, the round city of peace represented unprecedented achievements in urban planning, architectural innovation, and cultural synthesis. Within the magnificent palaces that rose along the Tigris River, where the scent of rose gardens mingled with the smoke of countless braziers, lived the Ghilman, young male companions whose lives embodied the complex relationship between Islamic religious principles and the cosmopolitan luxury that characterized Abbasid court culture. The Silk Road trade networks that brought these young men to Baghdad represented one of the most extensive commercial systems ever developed, connecting civilizations from the Atlantic to the Pacific through routes that carried not only goods, but also ideas, technologies, and human beings whose diverse origins enriched the cultural life of the Abbasid capital. The Ghilman came from regions as distant as Central Asia, the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, and beyond, their exotic appearances and varied cultural backgrounds making them valuable additions to a court that prized sophistication and international connections. The castration centers in Samarkand and other Central Asian cities had evolved into specialized institutions that served the administrative needs of Islamic empires, while also reflecting the complex theological and legal debates that surrounded the practice of creating eunuchs for court service. These facilities operated according to medical procedures that had been refined through centuries of experience, though the mortality rates remained high and the psychological trauma was invariably severe for the young men who underwent these transformations. The journey from these distant centers to Baghdad was itself a form of education, as the Ghilman traveled along routes that passed through some of the most important cultural and commercial centers of the medieval world. They experienced the diversity of Islamic civilization firsthand, observing the different ways that Islamic principles were interpreted and implemented across regions whose ethnic, linguistic, and cultural characteristics reflected the religion's rapid expansion beyond its Arabian origins. Upon arrival in Baghdad, these young men entered a world of unprecedented luxury and cultural sophistication that amazed even visitors from the Byzantine Empire and other wealthy civilizations. The Abbasid court had inherited Persian administrative traditions and adopted Byzantine ceremonial practices while developing distinctively Islamic approaches to governance and cultural expression that created new synthesis of traditions. From across the known world, the golden carved perfume burners that filled palace chambers with aromatic smoke represented the pinnacle of Islamic decorative arts. Their intricate geometric patterns and calligraphic inscriptions reflecting the mathematical and linguistic achievements that made Abbasid culture one of the most intellectually sophisticated in human history. The perfumes themselves came from sources throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Ambergris from the Indian Ocean, musk from Central Asia, rosewater from Damascus, and exotic essences from lands as distant as Southeast Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. The oud recitals that provided evening entertainment represented one of the most refined musical traditions ever developed, as Islamic musicians had transformed this ancient stringed instrument into a vehicle for artistic expression that combined technical virtuosity with spiritual and emotional depth. The modal systems that governed oud performance were based on mathematical principles that connected musical harmony to cosmic order, while the improvisational traditions allowed individual performers to express personal creativity within established frameworks. The musical education required for these performances involved not only technical training in finger positions and rhythmic patterns, but also deep understanding of the poetic traditions that provided lyrics for vocal accompaniment. As Arabic poetry had achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication under Abbasid patronage, the Gilman learned to sing verses by masters like Abu Nuwas and Al-Mutanabi, whose works explored themes ranging from religious devotion to worldly pleasure with linguistic brilliance that influenced Arabic literature for centuries to come. The storytelling traditions that flourished in Abbasid court culture provided the foundation for what would eventually become the collection known as 1001 Nights. Though the tales that entertained 9th century caliphs were often quite different from the versions that would later become popular throughout the world, the Gilman learned to recite these stories with dramatic flair that could hold audiences spellbound for hours. Their performances, combining entertainment with moral instruction, in ways that reflected Islamic values while providing escapist pleasure. These narrative traditions drew on sources from throughout the known world, incorporating elements from Persian epic poetry, Indian folktales, Greek philosophical allegories, and Arabian tribal legends in synthetic creations that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Abbasid civilization. The Gilman, with their diverse cultural backgrounds, often contributed stories from their homelands that were then adapted to conform to Islamic moral and aesthetic standards. The role of Caliph al-Muqtadir's intimate librarians illustrates the complex ways that personal relationships could be transformed into scholarly and administrative responsibilities, as these Gilman used their access to royal favor to advance intellectual projects that enriched Islamic civilization while also enhancing their own positions within the court hierarchy. Their work in collecting, copying, and translating texts from various languages and cultures contributed to the preservation and transmission of human knowledge during a period when libraries in Baghdad contained more books than existed in all of Western Europe. The translation movement that characterized Abbasid intellectual life required linguistic abilities that many Gilman possessed as a result of their diverse origins and cosmopolitan education, making them valuable participants in scholarly projects that introduced Islamic civilization to the philosophical, scientific, and literary achievements of Greek, Persian, Indian, and other cultures. Their contributions to these translation efforts often went unrecognized by later historians, but their work was essential for the cultural flowering that made Baghdad the intellectual capital of the medieval world. The manuscript illumination, and calligraphy that adorned the books produced in palace workshops represented the pinnacle of Islamic book arts. As Gilman, who had artistic abilities, contributed to the creation of volumes whose beauty and technical excellence demonstrated the cultural achievements of Abbasid civilization. The geometric patterns and floral designs that decorated these manuscripts required mathematical knowledge and artistic skill that took years to develop. The palace guard coups that periodically disrupted Abbasid political stability created dangerous situations for Gilman, whose intimate relationships with caliphs made them vulnerable to persecution when power shifted to new factions. The Turkish military units that increasingly dominated Abbasid administration often viewed the Gilman with suspicion, seeing them as representatives of Persian and Arab cultural influences that conflicted with their own ethnic and military interests. These political upheavals illustrate the precarious nature of positions that depended entirely on personal relationships rather than institutional authority. As Gilman, who had achieved great influence under one caliph, might find themselves exiled, imprisoned, or executed when political circumstances changed. The palace intrigues that surrounded these power struggles were Byzantine in their complexity, involving competing factions whose rivalries reflected broader tensions within Islamic civilization. The theological debates that characterized Abbasid intellectual life often had implications for the legal and social status of Gilman. As Islamic legal scholars struggled to reconcile the practical advantages of eunuch service with Quranic principles and prophetic traditions that emphasized the importance of marriage and family life. These discussions reflected broader tensions between the Persian administrative practices that the Abbasids had inherited and the Arabian cultural values that provided the foundation for Islamic law and ethics. The institution of the Hizbah, or market inspection, that regulated commercial and moral conduct in Baghdad, created oversight mechanisms that sometimes affected the Gilman, whose behavior was subject to scrutiny by religious authorities concerned with maintaining Islamic moral standards. These regulatory systems reflected the ongoing tension between the cosmopolitan luxury that characterized court life and the ascetic ideals that many Islamic religious leaders considered more appropriate for Muslim societies. Daily life for the Gilman followed routines that reflected both the ceremonial demands of Abbasid court culture and the religious obligations that Islamic law imposed on all believers, as they needed to balance their roles as entertainers and companions with their duties as Muslims whose conduct was expected to conform to religious principles. Morning prayers in palace mosques where the architecture itself proclaimed Islamic values, while accommodating the luxury that wealthy patrons expected. Afternoon lessons in various subjects that ranged from Quranic recitation to Persian poetry, from mathematical calculation to astronomical observation, as Abbasid education emphasized the comprehensive knowledge that was considered necessary for effective court service. The House of Wisdom and other scholarly institutions provided resources for this education, while also creating opportunities for intellectual exchange that enriched Islamic culture. Evening entertainments that combined religious observance with carefully regulated social interaction, as Islamic moral standards required that pleasure-seeking activities conform to religious principles, while also acknowledging human needs for beauty, art, and companionship. These gatherings often featured musical performances, poetry recitation, and scholarly discussion that created intellectually stimulating environments. The bathing facilities that were essential features of Islamic palace architecture provided venues for personal hygiene that was both religiously required and aesthetically important, as Islamic culture placed great emphasis on cleanliness as both physical necessity and spiritual obligation. The hammams associated with palace complexes were architectural marvels that combined functional design with artistic beauty in ways that enhanced the daily experience of maintaining personal cleanliness. The gardens that surrounded palace buildings created outdoor environments that served both aesthetic and practical functions, as Islamic garden design sought to create earthly reflections of the paradise described in the Quran. while also providing pleasant venues for various court activities. The geometric layouts, water features, and aromatic plants that characterized these gardens reflected both artistic sophistication and religious symbolism. The charitable activities that Islamic law required of wealthy Muslims provided opportunities for Gilman to participate in social welfare projects that served both religious and practical purposes, as their contributions to hospitals, schools, and other institutions helped maintain the social fabric of Islamic society, while also demonstrating their commitment to religious principles. These activities often outlasted their court careers and provided alternative sources of social status and personal satisfaction. The pilgrimage obligations that were incumbent upon all Muslims who possessed sufficient resources created opportunities for Gilman to travel to Mecca and other holy sites, experiences that provided both spiritual fulfillment and practical knowledge of the broader Islamic world. These journeys often involved months of travel through regions whose cultures and economies were connected to but distinct from the cosmopolitan environment of Baghdad. The commercial activities that connected court life to international trade networks provided opportunities for some Gilman to participate in business ventures that could provide financial security beyond their court service, as their cultural knowledge and linguistic abilities made them valuable intermediaries in commercial relationships that extended throughout the Islamic world and beyond. As evening settled over the round city of peace, and the call to prayer echoed from hundreds of minarets while oil lamps flickered in palace chambers where silk hangings created intimate spaces within vast buildings, these rose-scented companions would prepare for duties that might include anything from religious observance to artistic performance, from scholarly discussion to intimate companionship. Their lives, suspended between Islamic religious principles and cosmopolitan luxury, between individual advancement and religious obligation, between cultural diversity and religious unity, embodied the contradictions and possibilities of a civilization that sought to create universal brotherhood while accommodating the diverse traditions and human needs that characterized its vast territories. Moonlit Court Poetry. Heian, Japan, 10th CE. In the 10th century of the Common Era, when the Heian court had achieved unprecedented refinement in artistic expression and cultural sophistication, the imperial capital of Kyoto represented a unique flowering of aesthetic sensitivity that would influence Japanese civilization for over a millennium. Within the wooden palaces, whose elegant proportions and subtle decorative details reflected distinctively Japanese concepts of beauty and harmony, lived the kosho, male pages whose existence embodied the complex relationship between Chinese cultural influence and indigenous Japanese values that characterized this remarkable period. The aristocratic gender fluidity that distinguished Heian court culture from the more rigid hierarchies that characterized Chinese and other Asian civilizations created environments where the boundaries between masculine and feminine aesthetic ideals became pleasantly blurred, allowing for forms of artistic expression and personal relationship that would have been impossible in societies with stricter gender role definitions. This flexibility reflected deeper Japanese cultural values that emphasized harmony, adaptability, and the cultivation of sensitivity to natural beauty and human emotion. The kosho, who served in these refined environments, came primarily from the lower ranks of the court nobility, young men whose families possessed sufficient cultural education to appreciate the aesthetic values that governed palace life, while lacking the political influence or economic resources that would have provided alternative pathways to a taste advancement. Their service represented both an opportunity for personal cultivation and a form of patronage that connected different levels of the aristocratic hierarchy. The physical beauty that was considered essential for court service was defined according to aesthetic standards that differed significantly from those of other civilizations, as Heian culture prized pale skin, delicate features, and graceful movement over the more robust masculine ideals that characterized military-oriented societies. These preferences reflected broader cultural values that emphasized refinement and sensitivity over physical strength and aggressive competitiveness. The incense battles that formed one of the most distinctive aspects of Heian court entertainment were elaborate competitions that combined olfactory discrimination with poetic composition and social interaction in uniquely Japanese ways. Participants were required to identify different aromatic woods and resins while composing poems that captured both the sensory experience and the emotional associations that specific scents evoked, creating artistic performances that engaged multiple senses simultaneously. The preparation for these competitions required years of education that encompassed not only technical knowledge about aromatic materials and their sources, but also deep familiarity with the literary traditions that provided frameworks for poetic composition. The Kosho learned to recognize dozens of different incense varieties, while also mastering the complex rules that governed classical Japanese poetry composition. The aromatic materials used in these competitions came from sources throughout East and Southeast Asia, as Japanese trade networks had developed to supply the court's sophisticated demands for luxury goods that could enhance aesthetic experiences. Sandalwood from India, aloes wood from Southeast Asia, and various other aromatic substances were imported at enormous expense to create olfactory environments that proclaimed Japanese cultural achievement, while providing sensory pleasures that were considered essential for cultivated life. The waka contests, that provided another major form of court entertainment, represented one of the highest achievements of Japanese literary culture, as these 31-syllable poems required technical mastery and emotional sensitivity that could capture profound meaning in extremely compressed forms. The Kosho learned to compose verses that met the strict formal requirements, while also expressing personal creativity and emotional authenticity that could move audiences to tears or laughter. The poetic traditions that governed these competitions had been refined through centuries of cultural development that synthesized Chinese literary influences with indigenous Japanese aesthetic sensibilities, creating new forms of artistic expression that were distinctively Japanese, while also reflecting the cosmopolitan sophistication that characterized Heian court culture. The seasonal imagery, emotional subtlety, and linguistic playfulness that characterized the best waka represented achievements that influenced all subsequent Japanese literature. The midnight carriage rides along the Kamo River that provided opportunities for more intimate cultural activities, created romantic atmospheres where personal relationships could develop within the carefully regulated social framework, governed court life. These excursions often involved groups of nobles and their attendants who would travel to scenic locations for poetry, composition, musical performance, and the cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity that was considered essential for civilized life. The carriages themselves were works of art whose design and decoration reflected the refined taste that characterized all aspects of Heian material culture. Their wooden frames carved with elegant patterns and their silk hangings dyed in subtle color combinations that proclaimed their owners' aesthetic sophistication. The ox-drawn vehicles moved slowly enough to allow passengers to observe and appreciate the natural beauty that provided constant inspiration for artistic creation. The riverbank locations that were favored for these nocturnal excursions had been selected for their natural beauty and their associations with classical poetry, as specific places had acquired cultural significance through their appearance in famous poems or their connection to historical events. The appreciation of these locations required cultural knowledge that connected natural observation to literary tradition in ways that enriched aesthetic experience. The seasonal timing of these excursions was carefully calculated to coincide with natural phenomena that provided optimal opportunities for aesthetic appreciation, as Japanese culture had developed extraordinary sensitivity to the subtle changes in weather, vegetation, and light that marked the passage of time. Cherry blossoms in spring, autumn moon viewing, and snow appreciation in winter created annual cycles of aesthetic celebration that structured court life around natural rhythms. The diaries of Murasaki Shikibu that provide our most detailed evidence for understanding Heian court life contain hints about discrete romantic relationships that may have involved the Kosho, though the indirect and elusive style that characterized Heian literature makes it difficult to distinguish between literary imagination and historical fact. These texts suggest that intimate relationships between court ladies and their male attendants were not uncommon, though they were conducted with discretion that reflected the complex social hierarchies that governed palace life. The Tale of Genji, that masterpiece of world literature that Murasaki Shikibu created during her court service, contains numerous references to beautiful young men who serve aristocratic households in capacities that combine practical service with aesthetic and emotional companionship. These fictional portrayals may reflect actual relationships that existed within the court, though the literary conventions of the period required that such matters be treated with indirection and subtlety. The aesthetic education that prepared Kosho for court service emphasized the cultivation of no-aware, that distinctively Japanese concept of the pathos of things that found beauty in transience and impermanence. This philosophical approach to aesthetic experience influenced all aspects of court culture, from poetry and painting to garden design and personal conduct, creating coherent worldviews that integrated artistic expression with spiritual understanding. The seasonal festivals that provided the major ceremonial occasions for court life created opportunities for elaborate displays of cultural achievement that combined religious observance with aesthetic celebration in distinctively Japanese ways. The Kosho participated in these events as both performers and audience members, their presence contributing to the visual and cultural effects that made these ceremonies important expressions of Japanese civilization. The musical traditions that accompanied these festivals synthesized Chinese court music with indigenous Japanese forms, creating new styles of composition and performance that reflected the cultural synthesis that characterized Heian civilization. The Kosho learned to play various instruments while also developing vocal techniques that prepared them for both solo and ensemble performances that enhanced the aesthetic impact of ceremonial occasions. The costume design that was essential for court appearances represented one of the most sophisticated fashion traditions ever developed. As Heian culture had evolved complex systems of color combination and seasonal appropriateness that could communicate subtle messages about the wearer's cultural knowledge and aesthetic sensitivity. The Kosho learned to select and coordinate clothing that would enhance their natural beauty, while also demonstrating their understanding of the cultural codes that governed court fashion. The layering techniques that characterized Heian costume required sophisticated understanding of color theory and seasonal symbolism, as the visible edges of multiple silk garments needed to create harmonious effects that were both visually pleasing and culturally appropriate. The achievement of perfect color combinations was considered a major artistic accomplishment that required years of study and practice. The religious activities that formed part of court life reflected the complex theological environment that characterized Heian Japan, where Buddhism and Shintoism coexisted in ways that created rich spiritual resources, while also generating philosophical tensions that influenced artistic and literary expression. The Kosho learned to participate in various religious observances while maintaining the aesthetic sensitivity that was their primary qualification for court service. The Buddhist monasteries that were closely connected to court life provided alternative communities where some Kosho could pursue religious careers that offered spiritual fulfillment and social status that were independent of their relationships with specific aristocratic patrons. These institutions often became centers of cultural activity that enriched Japanese intellectual and artistic life. The calligraphy that was considered one of the most important artistic accomplishments required not only technical skill in brush manipulation, but also deep understanding of the aesthetic principles that connected written characters to spiritual and emotional expression. The Kosho practiced various writing styles, while also learning to appreciate the aesthetic qualities that distinguished masterful calligraphy from merely competent writing. The garden design that characterized Heian palace architecture created outdoor environments that served as extensions of interior living spaces, their carefully planned landscapes providing venues for aesthetic contemplation and social interaction that enhanced the quality of daily life. The Kosho learned to appreciate these gardens as artistic achievements, while also understanding their symbolic significance within Japanese cultural traditions. The political activities that occasionally involved the Kosho reflected the complex relationships that connected court culture to broader issues of governance and social order, as their intimate access to aristocratic decision-makers sometimes made them valuable sources of information or influence. However, the aesthetic focus of Heian culture generally kept them removed from the military and administrative concerns that dominated political life in other civilizations. As moonlight filtered through the paper windows of wooden palaces and reflected off the still waters of carefully designed garden pools, these cultivated young men would prepare for nocturnal duties that might include anything from poetic composition to intimate companionship, from musical performance to aesthetic contemplation. Their lives, suspended between Chinese cultural influence and Japanese aesthetic innovation, between artistic accomplishment and social service, between natural beauty and human creativity, embodied the sophisticated cultural synthesis that made the Heian period one of the most aesthetically accomplished eras in human history.